ecosystem is still, as you said, suffering from some of the same staffing challenges that we're seeing in other sectors too. You know, the aviation industry is such a finely tuned machine that when you don't have all the right resources in all the right places at the right time, it can get challenged very quickly. You know, what we saw this at JetBlue actually back in March, and we made a decision, as hard as it was at the time, because no airline wants to take flights out of the schedule, to pull our capacity down by about 10%, because we looked at what was coming up and we were just concerned about our ability to reliably operate.
Do you think the regulator now needs to step in and say, enough guys, you all need to reduce capacity by 10-15%? We're not even into summer yet, Robin.
Well, I think for me, the most important thing, and you know what you see, Guy, and you're seeing it now, when things go wrong, people start pointing fingers at each other. The customer doesn't care. You know, the regulators, the air traffic control system, the airports, all the ground handlers, the airlines, we all have to work together to do that. And if we don't think we can operate, whether it's airports or airlines, in a reliable way, we need to bring things down. But you need to do it early. Customers don't want their flights cancelled the day before. So you know, we have to act now, and at an airport level or whatever, however we do it, we have to do our best to make sure that what we operate, we can do so reliably.
How long is that demand going to be around for? The Fed's raising rates aggressively, 75 bips coming through. We're expecting more of those kind of hikes to come, maybe even more further down the road. The objective here is to crush demand. So how long is the current demand surge that we're seeing going to last with the Fed doing that, with the possibility of a recession coming down the pipe?
No, it's a great question. We certainly expect to see more Fed rate hikes to kind of bring inflation back down. You know, I think there are two things I'd say about aviation, though, that are unique. First of all, there is still a lot of pent-up demand. So we know that there's a lot of people who haven't traveled for 2 years and they're not traveling this summer because what they want to do is just not available. You know, we just talked about we're all pulling flights down. It's going to make less seats available. The average price of airfares will go up because there's less seats. And so I do think you're going to see that demand flow into the fall. And secondly, business travel. Business travel is still coming back off a very low base. And so business travel is going to be better in Q4 this year than it was in Q4 last year.
Let's talk about the Spirit deal. 2016, you got Virgin on the block. Alaska wants it. You're in the running. Most people in this industry talk about the fact that effectively Alaska probably overpaid for that asset because of the fact that you were pushing them pretty hard. Are you worried that you may be getting into that kind of territory with Spirit?
No, I mean, we're very excited about creating this new national low-fare challenger. If you look at the value of the deal that we have on the table, you know, it offers great value when you compare it with recent opportunities like Virgin America. But having said that, you know, we're very excited. It's an all-cash offer. It's about a 60% premium of the competitive deal, and we have a lot of conviction to get it done.
What are you buying here? People are talking about the fact that you're buying basically Spirit's order book. They've got a lot of aircraft on order. Is that what you're buying here? What are you buying?
Well, guys, really four things. It is an order book that's exciting, and it has great similarities to our order book, so there's a lot of commonalities there. It's access to gates and infrastructure, airports that we want to be bigger in. We'd like to fly them more to markets like LAX. It's been very hard to get the gates to do that. A combined JetBlue Spirit will be a better competitor against the legacy airlines. We're buying access to skilled people. I mean, pilots, in-flight, maintenance. And we just talked about how we're all struggling with this. You take the JetBlue team and the Spirit team, both great teams, bring them together. It's going to allow us to continue to ramp up much more quickly. And also, by building this bigger national low-fare airline, just appealing to a bigger group of customers. Our loyalty program, our vacations program, all of these products we can bring to more people.
The CEO of JetBlue, Robin Hayes. This is Bloomberg.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
But ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Russia's unjustified aggression towards Ukraine is severely affecting the euro area economy, and the outlook is still surrounded by high uncertainty. But the conditions are in place for the economy to continue to grow and to recover further over the medium term.
ECB President Christine Lagarde testifying to European lawmakers within the European Parliament within the last few minutes. Bloomberg's Alex Weber joins us now from Frankfurt to dissect what President Lagarde had to say. So she's indicating that she doesn't think that the recession is a baseline at this point in time. Nevertheless, she's certainly kind of hinting at the fact that we are going to see an economic slowdown. She's also critically, Alex, not going to tell us what this new spread tool that the ECB is hinting at is going to look like. She talks about the OMT. What are we learning at this point about how the ECB is going to control spreads?
So the details on this anti-crisis tool are still somewhat scarce. Lagarde basically said, trust us, we're going to handle it. It's going to be effective and it's going to be within our mandate. It's going to come down to bond buying. The big question is what kind of conditions are going to be attached, what will trigger any reaction from the ECB, and will it be open-ended or have a fixed size? Those are the kind of questions we're still looking to answer.
Alex, Lagarde also sticking to her commitment to hike 25 come next month, the same thing she said in a blog post. But can the ECB really afford to just go at it at 25 when we're looking at 75 basis points from the Fed and more jumbo hikes from other central banks?
So the ECB has so far said that at least for the first interest rate hike, which will be the first in more than a decade, they want to take it slow, see how the market reacts. But then in September, they've already flagged that it could be bigger, meaning probably 50 basis points. So they still want to take it sort of slow, but it's important that she reiterated those plans today, signaling that the ECB won't get derailed by these market moves, which have seen Italian debt yields spike. So the ECB is essentially sticking to its plan. That's the big news from today, yeah.
All right, Alex, thank you very much. Bloomberg's Alexander Weber there. Now, from the ECB to the BOA in the UK, which is stumbling towards a recession as inflation spirals, and the pound is on course to retest its historic lows. That, according to the latest Bloomberg MLive Pulse survey. Joining us for more is Bloomberg Markets reporter Justina Lee. Justina, I love in the MLive Pulse survey, someone said the UK looks to be in one of the worst positions. I mean, just how negative is sentiment surrounding the region right now?
Right. I mean, of course, a lot of economies are facing the problem of stagflation. But I think for the UK, it really is particularly dire because you also have the political aspect to it. I mean, the UK is now moving to kind of rewrite the Northern Ireland Protocol. And there are still the lingering effects of Brexit as well as political uncertainty. And of course, as you and I both know, I mean, cost of living in the UK is, especially high, even by the standards of kind of what we're seeing across the developed world these days.
Justina, Catherine Mann was talking just a few minutes ago, and she was talking about the fact that the hikes that have been delivered thus far aren't about defending the value of the pound. But she did go on to talk about the fact that the value of the pound is having an impact on inflation in the UK. Are we going to get to the point where actually the Bank of England does need to defend the value of the pound because of that imported inflation?
Yeah, well, at least according to this latest Markets Live reader survey, I mean, the vast majority of them are kind of seeing a weaker pound and possibly even to like the early pandemic lows. And of course, that is a problem for the UK because the pound has actually even weakened more against the dollar than the euro has. And kind of that is another problem for inflation, given that the UK imports a lot of its goods.
What are our expectations around hikes when it comes to the BOE? Can they continue to go, or are they going to have to reverse course if a recession is coming sooner?
Yeah, I think that's really is kind of what they're grappling with right now, especially with kind of the Fed also moving at a faster pace so far, and at the same time they've got to worry about kind of economic growth as well. And at the same time, people are also expecting a worse time for UK stocks as well. So far, it's kind of done better with more value stocks, more energy shares, but it seems like people think they might give away some of that outperformance for the rest of the year.
All right, Justina, thank you very much. That's Bloomberg's Justina Lee there with the latest MLive Pulse survey. Now, a quick look at where markets are heading as we close out the hour when it comes to Europe. Of course, the U.S. cash market closed for the Juneteenth holiday, but European stocks, those moving slightly higher this morning, up almost 1%. Of course, perhaps take that with a grain of salt. Just because volumes are so light, perhaps it is some tactical moves after heavy selling last week, the biggest drop in U.S. equities since March 2020. Now, Guy, you and I have been talking about France much this past hour, with Macron losing the majority, or at least as large of a majority as he had when it comes to the National Assembly. That is affecting French assets. You're looking at OATs, 10-year yields, those higher by 8 basis points, by far underperforming the entirety of the region. At the same time, French stocks, those sinking. Stronger euro after Lagarde speaks, committing to 25 basis points and a tool. She won't say what it is, but says there is a crisis tool taking shape. So your euro at 105. Now, coming up on the European close, Guy and I will speak to Charlotte Ryland, co-head of investments at CCLA Investment Management. She'll join us next. This is Bloomberg.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com webinars.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
It's Monday, the 20th of June. Risk assets bid in Europe, but with U.S. markets closed for the Juneteenth holiday, and Christine Lagarde committed to 25 basis points next month. How long can the gains last? The countdown to the close starts right now. So we are looking at Europe moving higher. Of course, volumes are light. Juneteenth holiday in the U.S. futures are trading. They do look similar to what we're seeing in Europe. France underperforming this morning. French stocks up about just 0.2%. OATs, those underperforming as well. Yields moving higher. Guy, I'm going to grab some water. You take it from here.
That sounds like a pretty good idea. I'll pick it up. Danny's going to get some water. Let's talk about what is happening in France. As she alluded to, the French President, Emmanuel Macron, has a few issues. It looks like he has now lost control of the National Assembly. This after the far left and the far right made a strong showing in Sunday's vote. For the impacts, we go now to Caroline Conan, who is standing outside the French National Assembly over in Paris. Caroline, what does this do to Emmanuel Macron's agenda for his second term?
There was a lot of thunder last night and rain in Paris, Guy, and clearly it is a major blow for Emmanuel Macron because he is going to be stuck between a very strong far left, the NUPES coalition around Jean-Luc Mélenchon from the far left, who got 131 seats in this runoff, and the far right of Marine Le Pen, the National Rally, who actually surprised everyone last night with nearly 90 seats, a historical record, in fact, in 1986, which was their last record. They only had 35 MPs sent to the National Assembly. And you know, historically, Guy, this system, this two-round system, has been designed in 1958 by Charles de Gaulle with the Fifth Republic in order to prevent some instability in French Parliament. And 20 years ago, the 7-year mandate turned into a 5-year mandate with the president elected, and 2 months later, just after the parliament elections, in order to make sure that the president would get a majority. And this is the first time in 20 years that this isn't the case. Emmanuel Macron falling short of a majority, which is going to make the country very difficult to govern for the second mandate.
So what policy aims, what expectations had been baked into the market, Caroline, that now need to be rethought?
So clearly, this is going to undermine investors' confidence, and this could also weigh on the fiscal outlook of France, which is obviously not the best time when you have a rising interest rates environment and very high debt levels in France, above 110% of GDP. And clearly, the first reform that Emmanuel Macron wanted to pass was the pension reform. He wanted to raise the retirement age to 65. This pension reform that he was not able to do during his first mandate due to the pandemic. And this reform is going to be very difficult to pass now with the strength of the far left in parliament, with the danger of creating some social tensions, possibly some new yellow vest type of protests in the streets. And already the far left coalition has called for a no confidence vote early July. So possibly over the next few months or within the next 2 years, we could see the government fall and possibly new elections again. And this is going to be clearly a very chaotic second mandate for Emmanuel Macron.
All right, Caroline, thank you very much. Bloomberg's Caroline Conan. Also just getting some lines crossing. Of course, UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson had some very minor surgery. That's how they explained it. Some nasal surgery I believe. His spokesman saying that he as well has had meetings, also saying it's, quote, deeply disappointing that rail strikes are going ahead. So that's the picture in the UK. So let's get the latest on markets with Charlotte Ryland, co-head of investments at CCLA Investment Management. Charlotte, thanks so much for joining. Look, there's some issues when it comes perhaps to UK politics. France, National Assembly, that now being thrown not in Macron's favor. How much are you factoring volatility when it comes to European politics?
I think in terms of Europe, it's obviously going to be more difficult for France in order to do, particularly in a reformist agenda. I mean, you know, the big question with Europe will be how they deal with raising rates and how they cope with the periphery, which are obviously much more you know, fragile economies. In terms of the UK, clearly everybody's thinking about strikes tomorrow, which will be lovely.
Good luck.
Shades of the 1970s. But, you know, I mean, I think, you know, unions are a much less of a presence in the UK economy than they were back in the 1970s, a much more flexible labour market. So, yes, it will be causing problems in certain areas, but, you know, we wouldn't expect that to spread in quite the way that it did back then.
But Charlotte, if we think about the fact that we are seeing inflation, we are seeing government policy having a meaningful impact on that, should investors think about government that is ineffectual in Europe as a good thing or a bad thing? Do we need active government at this point, or do we need actually government to do less, not more?
I mean, I think there's going to be two worries for governments. There's going to be making sure that, you know, unemployment and the economy doesn't worsen, whether there's any action that they need to be taking there. I mean, I think governments also need to be making sure that, you know, the debt situation, given that rates are moving up, that again is going to be something of a strain for them. But I mean, you know, radical policy changes, you know, beyond what might be needed in terms of the Ukraine situation, you probably wouldn't be expecting a huge amount.
Speaking of debt, I mean, you point out 20% of global debt markets now yielding above 4%. JP Morgan Asset Management, they've said that, look, next time that there's another sell-off, or at least if we enter really deep recession, because yields are so high, bonds will start to act again as a reliable hedge in a risk-off environment. Do you agree? Will bonds become attractive again, just given how high yields have gone?
I think they're looking a little bit more attractive. We'd say probably the inflation-linked securities are probably slightly more attractive, things like US tips, because they're actually producing a real yield. But I think, you know, there probably is some further to go in terms of bond yields. I mean, yes, they've moved an awfully long way this year, but, you know, if you look at compared to the history, they're not particularly high. If you think about, you know, the very high levels of inflation we've still got at the moment, and the pressure on central banks and the aggression of central banks, we could see that continue, and therefore you could begin, you know, continue to see that pressure and continue on bonds.
Charlotte, what does that mean for the European banking sector? A banking sector that continues to hold significant amounts of European government debt.
I think it continues to make it quite a difficult situation for them. I mean, they're obviously better capitalised than they were back 10 years ago when we had the global financial crisis. But, you know, banking systems have really struggled to make money over the last 10 years because you've had negative interest rates. And I think it continues to be a difficult place for them, particularly if credit starts to worsen.
But if credit does worsen, how bad will this downturn be in terms of credit markets? Just because balance sheets are strong, there does seem to be more resilience. If we do get a recession, will the credit cycle look different this time?
At the moment, I'm not seeing any evidence that it's going to be anything as bad as the global financial crisis. Absolutely. I think there will be certain pockets. We've already seen some big bankruptcies coming through. Revlon, I think, last week. You know, so where people have got very over-leveraged, I think that's going to be problematic. Maybe some of the newer business models might be in trouble. But, you know, I think in general, it's not going to be quite as severe as it was.
Charlotte, if the game at the moment is to avoid losing money, do I want to have money at work in Europe?
I think you would selectively. Yes, of course, there are some great global companies within Europe. So, you know, things like Nestle, for example, L'Oreal, some of those defensive names, some of the pharmaceutical names we think look reasonably attractive and, you know, running according to you know, the growth and demand for their drug profile. So things like a Roche, for example, I think remain a reasonably defensive place to be. But, you know, I think the more cyclical end of the markets will continue to struggle. You know, I wouldn't particularly a place we chase.
I find this part of the remarkable thing is that sentiment is really negative right now. You look at the survey, be it Bank of America, be it AAII, and usually these are levels you say, okay, it's time to take a contrarian take. It's time to jump in. Things will mean revert. Can we use those same types of signals this time around?
I think we've got two things going on with markets. The first part of this sell-off has been about adjusting to different bond yields and the fact that we have got a very different interest rate environment. We haven't got quantitative easing. The second part of the sell-off is probably going to be about earnings levels, and whether those come under pressure and whether margins come under pressure. And certainly the market is beginning to price some of that margin pressure.
Do you think they will? Will margins come under pressure?
I think certainly in some sectors they definitely are. I mean, we've really seen cracks within the consumer area. Some of the retailers really beginning to struggle, having the wrong inventory, struggling with wages, etc. So we're beginning to see some of that. I imagine you could probably extend that out in some of the industrial areas as well. That will be the big call for the second half, is actually if we push ourselves into recession, is that priced in? And I suspect it probably isn't.
Charlotte, how can you invest in Europe if you don't know whether Russia is going to turn the gas on or off?
I mean, I think Europe is obviously trying very hard to find alternative sources of energy. I think there's talk about getting some of the coal power stations back up and running as a sort of temporary measure. Clearly they can bring in gas in terms of LNG, and that those exports have been picking up. Luckily we are in the summer, so demand for gas is slightly less than it would be if we're in the midst of winter. But that's definitely going to have to be the shift that Europe's going to have to make is away from reliance on Russia.
Well, so if that part of Guy's proposition there, if that is the equation where Russia does turn the gas off, what changes in your strategy?
I think you continue to be very cautious on the European economy. I think that probably means that the US remains a somewhat more attractive place to be in terms of the robustness of that economy. Yes, they're getting the problems in terms of fuel prices, but it's nowhere near as severe as what we're seeing in Europe. So I think that preference to the US probably continues.
John, if I want to be risk adverse in this market, and I want to think about kind of some of the strategies that I want to deploy to make that work for me, can you just kind of walk me through? Do I want to be largely in cash? Is it just linkers that is the place to put money to work in the bond market? I heard what you were saying just a moment ago about the bond market and the fact that yields are going to go higher. If I'm cautious and I worry about the fact that actually there is still economic pain coming towards both Europe and the United States, China potentially in the mix as well, how do I position a portfolio? 60/40 is having a terrible time right now. How do I build a portfolio that is going to protect me, at least from the bulk of the downside that we're likely to see going forward from here?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, 60/40 isn't working. We have got nothing in the bond markets at the moment. We're thinking about linkers, but we haven't made that move yet. We have got elevated levels of cash. Clearly, cash isn't providing you inflation at the moment, but it is at least providing something of a yield, and it certainly isn't going down. And then in terms of equities, very much focusing on quality companies, those who've got high returns, those who've got pricing power, decent gross margins, decent balance sheets, and which are actually still producing a reasonable level of growth. And then also, maybe some of the alternative assets, things like property, things like infrastructure, those continue to look reasonably well placed and actually have degree of inflation proofing in their cash flows as well.
Charlotte, we're going to be there. Greatly appreciate you joining us in London. Charlotte Ryland, co-head of investments over at CCLA Investment Management. Up next, we're going to go back to that issue of the French Assembly election that we saw over the weekend. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, making history in those elections, not in the way that he'd hoped for. We're going to get the latest next. Jeremy Gens, HEC Paris Associate Professor of Economics and International Affairs, joining us to give us his opinion. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
About what they call black soot caused by the manufacturing and consumption of these fuel products in the illegal refineries.
Oil theft, known as bunkering, and the refining of its spoils is worsening the damage from decades of fossil fuel exploitation, creating one of the world's most severe ecological disasters.
Our sacred forests, our homes have to give way to oil wells, and no one gets much benefit.
Imagine a resident of Port Harcourt who inhales this soot every second in 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30 days in the month, and for years now, we are dying slowly but surely, and our lifespan is reducing every day.
There certainly is room for compromise. I mean, after all, everyone knows the environment's a critical issue, the recession or the threat of a recession is a critical issue, international politics are critical, so there's plenty of room on which everyone could agree if they wanted to. The question really is whether or not they're going to be able to do that.
Annabelle Levay there, Science Po professor on the fate of Francis Macron. Let's get some more perspective on the French elections. Joining us now is Jeremy Getz, HEC Paris Associate Professor of Economics and International Affairs. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining us in a beautiful sunny Paris there. So we now have Macron no longer having this hold on the parliament that he once did. What does this mean in terms of policy that we perhaps expected would be on the agenda that no longer is in play?
So he's going to have to look for allies inside Parliament, and that means that his platform, his agenda, is really going to be defined by the type of allies and the type of coalition he's going to be able to build. Today, the most obvious one is to look right and to try to see with Les Républicains and those 61 seats what he can achieve, especially that would add up to a majority in Parliament. It would hurt his centrist brand, I think, and that would probably undermine his own goals in the long run, but that's certainly the most obvious way of going forward right now. Maybe he'll look left and try to look for key figures to try to basically break that circumstantial coalition on the left, which is also a possibility. Those two options are on the table, I think, today.
Jeremy, if that doesn't work, do you think we're looking at fresh elections here?
Possibly. It will take a little time because I think that even if you do that, you're still going to see the same Macron backlash that you saw last night. So this probably can't happen in 6 months or in a year. It probably has to happen 2 years after he's able to demonstrate how big of a logjam the country is in. And in order to take back, I guess, public discourse away from the pandemic, away from Ukraine, and back on France and on the type of reforms he wants to carry out and why they make sense. So it's going to take a little while, probably a couple of years. This being said, it doesn't mean that he can't achieve anything. It really depends on the coalition and how crafty he's going to get in the following months.
We're talking about a coalition getting crafty. I mean, this is certainly a different dynamic. I mean, I guess it's obviously a different dynamic than 2017. What does that mean in terms of how different a 2022 Macron is versus a 2017 version of himself?
Yeah, I think that's the million-dollar question. You know, there's plenty of literature in the political science that suggests left and right is dead. Now the real divide is between those who want to protect the populations versus those who want to reform a country and make it adapt to globalization. 2017, Macron was clearly the second school of thought, adapt. Now he's turning a little bit more to the first school of thought in terms of how do you protect these populations. This means anti-inflation measures, especially on the energy bill. It means a lot of conversation about the French purchasing power. It means a lot of conversations about unemployment benefits. Those are going to be the type of discourses and the type of debates he's going to have with potential allies inside Parliament. And again, for now, there's a lot of politics. I think spirits are running very high. And the real question is, who is going to be willing to come on board?
Jeremy, The president is going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about domestic policy. Where does that leave Europe?
So it's interesting. He probably is going to have to reassure Europe. There's no domestic French policy without reassuring the European partners, in particular Berlin and Germany. So those go hand in hand. Another way to think about this as well is that in the French tradition, the president is most likely going to take care of foreign policy while the prime minister is going to take care of domestic politics. So you can expect Macron to try to take a backseat, to try to basically take a little bit of distance with all of this, but he's most certainly going to be maneuvering, at least outside of public eye. The real question is going to be, again, what does France want to stand for? There's plenty of talks about strategic autonomy, but a lot of people in Europe are getting very fed up with this Macron way of thinking. There's a lot of talk about trying to think about where Europe stands in this whole struggle between China and the United States. Here too, I think Macron has kind of lost a little bit of his credibility. So it seems that, we're probably going to see a government very hyperactive to try to get things done and to demonstrate how willing it is to get that extra mile for the French people. Macron is probably going to be trying to test waters and trying to find a position that looks a lot like traditional French presidents that he wanted not to become, unfortunately for him.
Jeremy, what you're describing here, look, some of it is idiosyncratic to France, but the issues of high inflation, cost of living, these are problems the totality of Europe and really the entire world is dealing with. With political upheaval, should we be expecting more of it just in the wider Eurozone because of these issues you're highlighting?
It's certainly a risk out there. And what I worry about is how much can governments be credible in reassuring these fears of very legitimate fears from public opinions. Right now, it turns out that governments haven't had the capital and haven't enjoyed basically that credibility that they might have been able to have in another world after the pandemic. So this is indeed a crisis in legitimacy that Macron is facing and that a wide range of governments in Europe are facing. So maybe the positive news out of all of this is greater consultation, and probably Europe is going to feel far stronger, together rather than apart, because you're going to need that consultation going down the line.
Jeremy, the big winner to my mind from this weekend's elections was Marine Le Pen. How does this change her political fortunes? You talk about what is happening. Danny talked about the cost of living crisis. That was something that she has hit very, very hard. Clearly, her message resonated with the French people in this election.
Undoubtedly, and that rebranding effort she's been carrying out for quite some time, it has been successful. Again, the divide not between left and right, and I don't think she calls herself extreme right anymore. She calls herself, exactly what you said, at the service of the people, trying to protect the little guy, trying to protect the regular French person against inflation and against the woes and the turbulences of globalization. In many ways, she resembles, paradoxically, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and in many ways, she looks like all of those populist leaders you see in Europe and in the United States, for that matter, who are trying to basically question the benefits of globalization. I think that one real question is, again, to what extent can you undermine her discourse going down the line? Right now, she has a lot of political momentum on her side.
Yep. Jeremy, got to leave it there. Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. Jeremy Jez, HEC Paris Associate Professor of Economics and International Affairs. Thank you very much indeed. This is Bloomberg.
what's happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
It's time for the Bloomberg Business Flash, a look at some of the biggest business stories in the news right now. London's Heathrow Airport is asking some airlines to cancel a number of flights scheduled for today in the latest hitch to royal travel. Heathrow says it asked carriers to cancel about 10% of their flights in a response to a baggage system fault over the weekend. Last week, London Gatwick Airport said it would scrap hundreds of flights over the peak summer travel period. That after Amsterdam's hub took a similar step. ConocoPhillips says volatility in global gas markets may last years as it joins other Western energy firms by investing a $29 billion project to boost Qatar's export of fuel. The Houston-based company will buy 3.1% holding in the Northfield East project. Chief Executive Officer Ryan Lance announced the deal alongside Qatar's energy minister in Doha today. The U.S. economy will fall by likely a mild recession in the end of 2022 as the Federal Reserve raises rates to tame prices. That according to the latest outlook from economists at Nomura Holdings. The company warns financial conditions will tighten further, consumer sentiment is souring, energy and food supply distortions have worsened, and the global growth outlook has deteriorated. And that's the Bloomberg Business Flash. Now, as we head towards the European close, we look at European markets, which continue to trade higher. Of course, volumes are light today, given that the U.S. cash markets are closed for the Juneteenth holiday. Looking at outperformance for the FTSE 100, CAC 30 underperforming after Macron losing control of the National Assembly. We'll have the close up for you next. This is Bloomberg.
Companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
Stocks finishing up the day here in Europe. We are looking at gains on this Monday. Of course, it comes off the back of a very, very difficult week when it comes to not just European stocks, but U.S. stocks, of course, as well. So perhaps it is just some tactical buying on a day where volumes are very light. U.S. markets, of course, closed for the Juneteenth holiday. Outperforming so far today are UK markets up 1.4%. Back and forth between pound strength and losses. We're hearing from Catherine Mann of the BOE earlier, saying that they need to hike rates to get inflation under control, stop the decline of the pound, which has been adding to inflationary forces. So that's an interesting dynamic to watch there. Underperforming today is the CAC 40. That's up just 0.5% compared to the overall market. And that, of course, off the back of Macron losing control of the National Assembly, meaning he'll have to compromise much more. A lot of his policies, perhaps pro-business policies, are now going to come under question. So here's what we see for the entirety of the day for the Euro Stoxx 600. It really was just this slow melt up throughout the day, ending up about 0.9%. Again, this mirrors to what we're seeing in U.S. futures right now. But again, how much of it is just some tactical buying on a very, very light volume day? Last week, it was the worst week for U.S. stocks since March 2020. So perhaps it's not surprising to see some of the gains coming back. Now let's dig into the sectors for your Euro Stoxx 600. Nearly every sector ending in the green today. Just on the bottom, you have chemicals, financials. I can't read the last one, I'm going to be honest, but there is one more that fell. Oh, it's construction and material. I'm going to get into that in just a bit of why construction fell so much. But on the upside, you have banks. Now, this is pretty fascinating that banks were able to end the day higher. You did have yields moving up in the market. Perhaps that supported banks. But even French banks ended the day higher. They first had started to fall. Again, this concern over Macron not getting that parliamentary victory to which he had hoped for. Travel and leisure, second best performing, probably because Guy Johnson's been talking to airline executives, so that putting some optimism into the market. Energy, auto parts, telecom, those coming next in the list. Let me show you some of the individual movers as well. ABB, really fascinating story here, ending the day down 1.3%. They had planned to spin off their electric vehicle section, their business, into an IPO. They now say that they're going to wait and pause on that. Just given the volatility in the market, they are not ready to go with that IPO. It's something that we've seen a lot in this market, that issuance volume looking really light due to the volatility. It's an issue, of course, for the private markets as well, with issues of lack of exits. Now, I mentioned construction before being the worst performing sector. This is why Kingspan Group down 11.4%, just about. They're based in Ireland, having some earnings out today. Strong earnings, however, they warned that they are seeing some deterioration of mood in the past couple months. This is the biggest plunge since March 2020 on that. So declining orders, analysts say that is a worrisome development going forward. It shows that this cool down in the housing markets with central banks raising rates. So Kingspan falling dramatically there and dragging other construction companies down with it. And finally, Airbus, I mentioned travel and leisure, the second best performing sector. Airbus up 3.4%. Of course, Guy has been talking to executives all day. Some really interesting developments there, really demand being robust. I won't linger too much on this because, Guy, you of course know this story much better than I do, but really the entirety of the air travel sector performing pretty well today. Guy.
Absolutely. I'm not entirely sure I'm responsible, but I'll take the credit for it if it's out there and available. Danny, thanks very much. I want to come to our conversation with Guillaume Faury in just a moment. But before I do that, the president is speaking right now, President Biden, making some comments on this Juneteenth holiday. Let me just run through some of the comments that he is making. He's talking about the fact that it is very likely, quote, that Ukraine will become an EU member. Then we get on to some really interesting comments. He's saying a US recession isn't inevitable. These are he's live on the beach right now, as you can see, looking relaxed. I think he's recovered from his bike fall. His team, though, is going to be meeting oil company CEOs this week. That could be an interesting meeting. Let's just say the relations between the White House at the moment and the C-suite in a lot of oil companies isn't exactly the best. The president saying that oil firm CEOs to be asked to justify their profits. The president and the White House continuing to hit this industry very, very hard. He was talking about the refining industry last week. Are we moving in the direction of a windfall tax over in the United States on oil company profitability? Looks like this week could prove fairly pivotal for that story, and we may get some developments after that meeting. Let's get back to the Airbus story, though, right now. As Danny was saying, Airbus stock rising today. The company's CEO is, of course, Guillaume Faury. I have to say, I've known Guillaume for a long time. He's looking pretty buoyant right now. He's looking pretty happy. He says he's seeing record demand from airlines. Supply chains, though, are his biggest concern right now. They are still recovering from 2 years of shutdowns. I sat down with him a little bit earlier, as I say, down the road at the IATA general meeting in Doha, and we talked about that supply chain story, and we talked about the demand story as well. This is what he had to say.
So when we look at the supply versus demand on the single aisle, on the one we're ramping up now, under most of the scenarios, demand will remain higher, stronger than supply.
Yep.
So it's a supply-constrained environment for us on the single aisle. Well, we're ramping up back to rate 65 that we had just before COVID. So the production system is existing, but this has been idle for 2 years. So it's very difficult to get there, especially with the global situation on the marketplace. The supply chains are really disrupted. It's very difficult to ramp up at the pace we have defined to ourselves. In 2022, we want to ramp up by 20%.
Yep.
Okay? Then we'll go to rate 75. So I think demand will remain higher than supply. So it's a race on supply. We've defined a trajectory, and we're working very hard to stick to that trajectory. If at a point in time we have to slow down, we'll face the reality, but we are not there. At the moment, we stick to our plans.
Where are the biggest concerns? So we're hearing that, for instance, you're currently experiencing issues with engine manufacturers. There is a suggestion that maybe aircraft are being built without engines being available. A, is that the case? And B, is that where the biggest problem is going to lie? The joke in the industry is sometimes, and I'm sure you don't share this joke, that you bolt an aeroplane onto an engine, not the other way around. I'm sure you do. But is that where the real kind of concern is going to lie? Is that marrying of engines and airframes?
Well, it's a consequence of other reasons. Engine makers are facing the same problems than we are facing.
Yep.
And actually, these are difficulties across the board. It's not the situation that we have one commodity that is a problem or one region. We see across the globe the same problems on supply of microelectronic chips, small components, wires, connectors. We see shops that were closed for 1 year and a half having difficulties to ramp up because you don't find the people, the skills in number and in skills, and that's across the board. So everybody, all OEMs have a lot of difficulties to get their suppliers deliver on time, and it's a very complex supply chain. That's what we see for engine makers. That's also what we see for Airbus. Now, it's the fact that we're missing engines, and that's at the moment one of the big bottlenecks. And yes, indeed, we are starting to build what we call gliders in 2018, meaning planes without engines. That's a situation I don't like.
Yep.
Engine makers are telling us they will recover in the second half of the year. That's why we take the risk to build planes without engines in limited numbers, with the perspective to get engines at a later stage and being able to serve our customers. Because again, the demand is very strong.
A couple of kind of related but unrelated questions. I couldn't help see you sitting next to Mr. Al-Bakr at dinner last night. You've obviously had your issues with Qatar recently. Any sign of detente?
It's a complex matter. I don't like to be in that situation with one of my main customers. So we're working hard to try to resolve, but it's not an easy situation to manage. So I want to remain optimistic and think we'll find a way forward. And as you've seen, indeed, the relationship is good between the persons. So the organizations need to find a solution.
You are a CEO that has manufacturing bases across many jurisdictions, most of them in Europe. The politics of Europe seems to be getting more and more complicated. It just got more complicated overnight with the parliamentary elections in France that we've seen the results for. It looks like Mr. Macron is not going to have a majority. Does that make your life more complicated? How are you thinking about the politics of France right now and the politics of Europe?
Well, I won't comment too much on France because, as we just discussed before this interview, I have not had time to look at the detailed results and I don't yet understand fully what the consequences will be. But yes, the landscape in Europe is very complex. Europe is complex per se, but we see complex situations in countries, in major countries of Europe, that doesn't make our life easier.
Guillaume Faury, the CEO of Airbus, catching up with me a little bit earlier on, just down the road from where we're sitting right now at the IATA conference that is taking place here. Basically a gathering of most of the world's transport industry from basically all the way around the world. You've got Asian operators, you've got European carriers, you've got US airlines all at that event. Talking of US airlines, the pandemic obviously is hopefully now behind us. We're seeing a huge pickup in demand for airlines right now, but they are struggling with capacity. They're basically struggling to get all the seats that we're trying to book with them right now and get them up and running. And the chaos that we're seeing right now is basically testament to the fact that that is proving to be very, very difficult. Talking of optimists, I have to say again, Scott Kirby, the United CEO, one of the most optimistic guys I know out there. I caught up with him in the last hour. We talked about these challenges and how he's trying to fix them.
It is encouraging to see the huge increase in demand that we've seen really around the world, most recently with the change of the testing requirements here in Europe. At United Airlines, we've been a little bit different. We've been moderating our capacity. We're still 13% smaller than we were in 2019, despite the increase in demand. We don't have any staffing issues at United. To your point, there are a lot of infrastructure around, air traffic control being the biggest, that are causing real challenges for us and for others in the industry.
Just give me a flavor of how bad it is. Like on a typical day, you're trying to run your airline. Where are the bottlenecks? How significant are they?
So in the U.S. industry, at least, the biggest bottleneck is probably air traffic control. They're doing everything they can, but like many in the economy, have staffing issues like a lot. You take an airport like Newark Airport, we've had weekends recently where, it's under 50%, it's 50% staffing, and those controllers are working their tails off to be successful. But when you're at 50% staff, we got 89 operations scheduled, and they had us on a perfectly clear blue sky day at 36 operations per hour. And it's a nightmare for customers, for employees, for the airlines when you're in situations. But air traffic control in the United States is the biggest, and there's just no margin for error. A little bit of weather can cascade through the whole system.
Yeah. Let's talk about fuel prices. They've come up a long way. You're not hedged. Over the long term, you've always told me that that's the smart thing to do. Clearly, that's going to be hurting here and now. But do you think these new fuel prices, the levels we're at now, is this the new normal? Is this going to be sticky?
Yeah. So fuel prices, that's what's driving inflation more than anything in the economy, in my opinion. Certainly at airlines. At United Airlines, fuel prices right now, if they stay at today's level, $12 billion incremental expense compared to 2019.
What was 2019?
2019, would have been something like 12 to 14 billion. So doubling of fuel prices. That's 100% of what's driving inflation in our business. We are preparing for this to be the new normal. I hope that's wrong. I hope it's not. But particularly if you look at some of the structural issues, even if more oil comes online, the real problem that the economy is refining capacity. There's not enough refining capacity. And more oil is not going to solve the refining capacity in the short term. So we are planning for this to be the new normal.
So fares are going to stay elevated?
Certainly, if that forecast of jet fuel prices is correct, I expect fares, this will be the new normal for fares.
Robin Hayes was sitting in that seat a couple of hours ago, the CEO of JetBlue. He's trying to push through the Spirit acquisition. He's gonna have to give up a whole bunch of gates, bunch of slots at various airports. Where would you like to take advantage of that? Where could you take advantage of that?
Well, certainly the place that we, whether it's through JetBlue or somewhere else, we would like to get into back into JFK in a big way, particularly in the transcon market. So getting enough slots at JFK that we can get back to serving San Francisco and Los Angeles, particularly for business customers, and having another real option for business customers in those markets. That'd be our #1 priority. But also in New York, the whole New York airspace, treating the 3 New York airports, LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark, on a level playing field. The FAA should schedule all 3 of those airports like we do everywhere else in the world, with the amount of capacity that the airports can handle and not overscheduling them. And right now, one of those 3 airports is dramatically overscheduled.
Just to come back, Newark in particular as well, what difference could it make there?
In Newark, it could fix the operation. It'd be so much better for customers. The total would be so much better for, we can't put 10 pounds into a 5-pound bag. Right now, there's trying to put 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. And even on blue sky days, there's ground delay programs essentially 100% of the time at Newark Airport, even when there's perfect weather, simply because there's more flights scheduled to land at that airport than there is the ability for the airport to arrive.
Scott Kirby, the United CEO. This is Bloomberg.
The Indian city of Jamnagar is a money-making machine for Asia's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. His company Reliance has the world's biggest oil refinery complex here in the city. Jamnagar is also where Ambani is making his newest bet, a $10 billion investment in green energy. His ambition is closely aligned with the Indian government's plan to reach net zero emissions by 2070. But Ambani is not alone. India's second richest man, Gautam Adani, has committed $20 billion of investment over the next decade. But India's massive dependencies on fossil fuels have some environmental advocates questioning the realism and sincerity of those green ambitions and those of its 2 biggest billionaires.
Stocked early enough all these precious materials you were just mentioning, and we were on the lucky side that our prognosis was spot on in a way, forecasting what kind of material we would need and what quantity we would need.
Russia's unjustified aggression towards Ukraine is severely affecting the euro area economy, and the outlook is still surrounded by high uncertainty. but the conditions are in place for the economy to continue to grow and to recover further over the medium term.
ECB President Christine Lagarde addressing lawmakers of the European Parliament within the last hour, basically delivering her outlook for the economy and restating the central bank's plans to raise rates in July and September. Bloomberg's Alex Weber joining us now from Frankfurt. Alex, we know that the ECB staff are working really hard and trying to work really quickly to come up with a tool that is going to manage spreads in Europe, bunds and BTPs, trying to keep them fairly together. Did we get anything new today, any new hints as to what that tool might look like today from Lagarde?
So the details are unfortunately still a bit scarce. Lagarde was, of course, asked about this today in the European Parliament. She said, basically, don't worry, we're going to come up with something that works, that is within our mandate. She didn't give any answers to questions like, what size will it have? What conditions are going to be attached? For that, the ECB's, we will have to wait a little bit longer. The ECB is really under pressure to deliver and will probably have to come up with something in time for their next meeting, which is in a month's time.
And I'm looking at Italian 10-year yields up another 8 basis points today. Alex, is this a market that will continue to test the ECB when it comes to spreads?
That's certainly the assumption, that as long as the ECB doesn't put a credible tool on the table, the market is just going to test it again and again. So the ECB really needs to come up with something that is convincing, ideally so convincing that it doesn't even have to use it. That was the case with this previous anti-fragmentation weapon, which was OMT, introduced under Mario Draghi. It never had to be put into action, but it still really helped in calming the Eurozone debt crisis. So that could be a very favorable outcome for the ECB.
All right, Alex, thank you very much. Bloomberg's Alex Weber there from Frankfurt. Now, coming up, the second annual Qatar Economic Forum convening in Doha, where Guy is. We're going to have a preview of what's to come. This is Bloomberg.
When you think of cutting-edge technology at sea, you might be thinking of stuff like this. But there's an incoming revolution on the high seas that isn't quite as sexy, but could be significantly more impactful.
Container shipping is the key component of global trade. About 80 or 90% of all the world's goods are transported at sea at some point.
But there's a significant unseen cost to the modern era of global commerce.
About 3% of all the world's CO2 emissions come from shipping.
3% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly comparable to the entire CO2 output of Germany. Since reducing trade isn't a likely option, what about a technological improvement to help reduce the emissions from these well-stocked maritime behemoths?
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
All right, we are just after the European close. Let's take a look at where things settled up. We did see European stocks, those were able to power higher into the close, up more than 1% over the past 2 days. Of course, those gains there belie the volatility we have seen in markets in general. FTSE 100, that outperformed as well. That's also up 1% over the past 2 days. That in large part thanks to a rally in energy companies as commodity prices continue to power higher. Now, yields, those have also currently moving higher across Europe. You have ECB, Christine Lagarde has been speaking, talking about the commitment to keeping peripheral bonds in check, and at the same time, 25 basis point hikes. Now, of course, the Qatar Economic Forum is also going on. Guy, you're over there in Doha.
Yeah, it's going to kick off tomorrow. It's going to be a massive event. In some ways, I think you can draw a line between the ECB story and Qatar, actually. You think about what is happening with the gas story right now, absolutely front and center. This place is going to be providing a lot of gas going forward. Let's bring into this conversation, therefore, our Middle East correspondent, Simone Foxman. That's the story here, isn't it? This place is right at the epicenter of this gas story.
That's right, and we have a mega panel of the Qatari energy minister as well as energy executives from across the world, and we're going to hear them weigh in on what they think is happening in the global energy market. And, you know, for Qatar, which is expanding its natural gas LNG capacity by 60% by the end of the decade, they are going to play an important role in the global supplies of natural gas going forward if Europe can't rely on Russia.
So you and me, we think that Qatar is at the center of the world because it's at the center of the gas trade. For most people on this planet, Qatar is at the center of the world because it's about to host the World Cup. Everybody wants to know the question that I'm hoping you're going to give me the answer. Are they going to be ready?
Well, the stadiums are already ready, and a lot of the infrastructure projects were ready maybe a year ahead of schedule. So from that perspective, yes, things are ready. But, you know, this is the first time we're seeing any major global sporting event in the Middle East. It's going to be this massive event. How is Qatar going to deal with people who are not necessarily as respectful of their customs? How are they going to deal with a massive influx of people? Where are they going to house them? Those are big questions we're still looking for the answer to.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are still looking for the answer to that. The other thing that we're going to be focusing on tomorrow is not energy, it's not football, it's Elon Musk. He's going to be here.
Yes.
Just kind of give us the schedule for Musk Watch tomorrow.
I mean, we're really interested in what he has to say about Twitter, right? Initially, the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, they were not all on board. The large Middle Eastern investors were not all on board with his plan to acquire Twitter. And then they suddenly kind of did this about face, QIA among them, a major holder of Twitter shares. So we want to see not only what he's thinking about with respect to Twitter right now, but also what kind of role these massive pools of Middle Eastern wealth might play as he tries to take this plan forward.
It's going to be an interesting day. He is an interesting character. Who knows what ultimately we're going to get tomorrow? You've got to tune in. You've got to find out. Simone, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That's the programming note that I'm going to leave you with. Qatar Economic Forum is going to kick off tomorrow. The headline act, first thing tomorrow morning, the Tesla CEO, potentially the Twitter CEO, Elon Musk. This is Bloomberg.
Of the year, but Bali is still quiet and empty. I am here in Kuta Legian, one of the main walking streets here that is used to be a tourist spot for beach, dinings, shopping, but many shops here are still closed. Most of the outlets are either for rent or for sale as they have run out of business.
Saya kerjanya di sini udah lama, udah ada 10 tahunan di sini kerja. Masih sepi sih, nggak kayak dulu. Kalau dulu kan rame, sekarang ya ada, 1-2 itu ada. Tapi nggak kayak dulu, kalau dulu rame sekali. Sekarang paling dapat jualan ya 100, 120 gitu, 200 ya. Kalau dulu sih ya nyampe dah 1 juta, 1,5 tuh nyampe dapat jualan. Bisa sampai 2 juta dulu. Sekarang nggak pernah lagi dapat segitu. Sama aja. Belum ada turis ke Bali. Masih ya domestik aja.
While Bali has reopened its borders for foreign tourists since October, they're still not coming in. Many international airlines are yet to reinstate their direct flight to the island. Balinese people here really hope they can see more people from Australia, China, and Europe to come visit next year.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question.
Great question.
Great question.
Great question. That's going to be the best question I get all night. I'm glad you asked that.
Bloomberg Television. Top experts. Great questions.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
However you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
You could trade anything as a trend fall.
When you think about Bitcoin, I don't think it's a currency. I think it's a commodity.
Today, we're in an everything bubble.
I'm Eric Schatzker, and welcome to Bloomberg's Front Row. Today, I'm talking to Gene Hines, the CEO of Wellington Management. Boston-based Wellington is one of the world's largest asset managers, with almost $1.3 trillion of investments. But because it's a private partnership, the firm has been shrouded in mystery. Gene is changing that. She's also making ESG investing one of Wellington's top priorities. She says sustainability will transform the structure of financial markets.
We don't think it's woke. We think it's part of, like, a very, very important part of studying the opportunity set and the risk set of 5,000 companies.
Is that to say there's alpha in ESG or alpha in sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely.
You believe that?
I believe that.
Gene and I explore the strategies and perspectives that make Wellington different and are defining her tenure as CEO. Why she still believes in globalization and having a presence in China. The virtues and challenges of active management. What to expect from Wellington's expansion into alternatives. The value of staying private. Here's my conversation with Gene Hines. Gene, Wellington is one of the world's largest investment firms, but relative to BlackRock, PIMCO, Fidelity, Vanguard, I could name others, of course, it's hardly known and certainly not well understood.
Yeah.
Why?
For a long history, we have had a very low public profile, so that would be number one. I would say another reason is that we are a sub-advisor, so our largest business, one of our largest businesses, to be a sub-advisor to other companies that are well-known household names, such as Vanguard and Fidelity and T. Rowe Price, for example. So we don't market directly to consumers. We are the content provider. So you combine those two, that we're not a household name, brand name, and also at the same time we had a very low public profile, is probably the reason most people don't know us.
Is having a low public profile, flying under the radar, if you like, being a little mysterious, good for business, a competitive advantage?
It probably served us well over time. I think for our current, if you look at in 2022, why am I talking to you today? I think the main reason is because we're a sub-advisor and we rely on partners, we're finding that it is important that that our brand is known for our content. I think very importantly, and maybe even more importantly, I also think it helps with talent. So it's very interesting that, you know, for years and years and years, we would try to attract talent and no one would ever know anything about us. And that served us, that was fine when we were a Boston-based company, but when we began to globalize and begin to hire investors all over the world, that didn't serve us well.
That's been a big change, hasn't it, in the asset management industry, the importance of having a brand. Most of the asset management industry has made a bet on sustainability.
Yeah.
But suddenly, ESG is under attack, right? There are state governments here in the US that are waging war on sustainable finance. They're calling it wokeism. What do you think of that?
We're not investing on sustainability from a value-based perspective. We're investing in our capabilities from a how do we research companies? How are these companies' earnings going to, what are the risks to the companies from ESG factors? What are the opportunities for companies from an ESG factor? So we don't think it's woke. We think it's part of, like a very, very important part of studying the opportunity set and the risk set of 5,000 companies.
Is that to say there's alpha in ESG or alpha in sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely.
You believe that?
I believe that. The alpha will all be in the nuance of company research. Which companies in the life science tools industry, for example, are going to create products to help biologic manufacturing be less emitting. You're only going to be able to figure that out by meeting with 20,000 companies like we do every year.
So the antithesis, if you will, of like building a momentum model and backtesting it.
The antithesis of what the factors were in the last decade.
Almost every CEO in almost every industry grew up believing that globalization was good. And globalizing has been a priority of Wellington's for 15 years.
Yeah.
Is that still the case?
Yes, I would suspect that as at the end of my tenure at Wellington, instead of having 30% of our employees in Europe and Asia, it could be closer to 40% of our employees. So we are deliberately and intentionally continuing to invest in our offices around the globe. But you're right that deglobalization we're in a period of regime change and deglobalization. I don't think that necessarily impacts our business to the extent that there is great investment talent all over the globe, really great investment talent. We don't have a monopoly. We used to think we had a monopoly of investment talent in Boston, and that clearly wasn't the case. You know, the reason we began to globalize our investment platform is that the world was expanding the number of companies that were in Europe and Asia. And who are we to say that we're going to follow all of those from our Boston office? That was the reason we began to expand. And I think that is still true, that this is a global firm, this is a global economy, and even if there are certain trends that are deglobalizing, there is still a world there for us to either think about from a company perspective or think about from an economic perspective.
China has become and is still becoming an increasingly complex place in which to do business. How do you manage that?
So we have a presence in our Hong Kong office, and we have a small presence in our China through a Shanghai office. We are expanding our license to be able to invest in the onshore China. Right now it's small, but it's an important place for us to do research.
Are you already starting to do anything differently because clients are concerned about inflation, because of the impact on their portfolios of rising rates, because of the potential for a recession, however long-lived it may be?
Well, I think our clients have not made major changes. There's definitely more interest in our commodities capabilities, our inflation capabilities, our value investing capabilities, which have been out of favor. And fortunately for us, we continue to invest in those teams. But those are probably on the margin more interest than they have had in the past.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
But ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Wellington is an active manager. No indexing?
No.
No passives?
No.
How come?
That's not our core skill set. Going back to what is our core skill set? Our core skill set is being a research-based company and having these teams of portfolio managers with different skill sets that practice their philosophy and process. So we're a research-based content company generating insights about the world. That's completely opposite of passive investing.
Am I correct in saying that the implicit promise to investors in actively managed products is that they'll either get alpha, right, beat the market,
Yeah.
or better risk-adjusted returns?
Yeah, I think for us that it would. I think it's clients are asking for both of those, right? Clients are asking for
want it all.
both alpha and risk-adjusted returns, and that's post the global financial crisis. The pathway of returns has become more important. But you go back to the basics. If you can generate 100 basis points of alpha, 200 basis points of alpha over indices, that is a tremendous compounding effect.
The reality, however, is that across the asset management industry, the active investment management industry, alpha is zero or sometimes negative after fees, and the returns aren't any better on a risk-adjusted basis. So if that remains the case, what is the future for active management?
We need to earn a return. We need to earn that alpha. So that's what we're trying to do. We've created an environment where we have this, and I do mean this. We have an incredible investment ecosystem. We don't have a CIO. We have this 600 person investment ecosystem that collaborates, that shares ideas, where different perspectives, different opinions on the same subject are welcome and thrive. If we can continue to do that, and that's the input, like, can we do that? Then hopefully our output over time will generate those returns.
Private assets and alternatives are still a small piece of Wellington's $1.2 trillion in AUM. How do you grow those parts of the business when the competitors are large, established, and in many cases, excellent at what they do?
We first went into the privates business in 2014, and so our first fund, our first group of fund is now on its fourth fund. So that
was the Growth Equity Initiative?
Yeah, so we have four, by the end of this year, we're gonna have 4 platforms: growth equity, biotech, climate technology, and investing in diverse founders. So where else can we go? So that's the question. Like, what are our ambitions?
Yeah, where else does it make sense to have a footprint?
We have a very large public footprint in credit. So there are areas that we should play on the private side in credit. To be successful, we don't have to be, it's not about being number 1 or number 2. It's about growing that part of the business and generating great results for clients that help the overall business. The same is true on real estate. So we have a very strong structured debt capabilities as well as real estate equity capabilities. So can we attract talent to help us complement those on the public side? You know, longer term, we have
one hybrid fund. You know, you could envision us having hybrid funds by sector that's like a natural extension. So we have such strong sector teams.
So those assets are what right now?
Those assets,
altogether,
by the end of the year, they should be 7 or 8 billion. So a small part, but still an important part of the business.
That's privates and alternatives.
Privates and alternatives are 7 to 8. The liquid alternatives, we've been in the long short business since 1994, and that business is approximately 30 billion.
Okay,
so
put them together and you're getting close to 40.
Yes.
Jean, there aren't many people in your position who started out as administrative assistants and rose to become CEO at the same company, really the only place you've ever worked.
Yes.
Tell me your story.
So I'll go back to college. So first of all, my parents were Irish immigrants. My mother raised 6 kids, and my father was a bricklayer. So I didn't know anything about the stock market. We didn't talk about stocks around the kitchen table at my house. But I would say they were very focused on education. And so I got practically a full scholarship to Wellesley College, which was an amazing experience. And as one of the classes I took, which was in my junior year, it was sociology. It was a sociology class that you had to get a job. Every college has a class you have to take. This was the class you had to take, but I just happened to get a job at a brokerage firm in Boston. And so that was my first introduction to the stock market. And I did not like the cold calling part of the business, but I was just fascinated by the stock market. And that's how I found my way to Wellington. And Wellington was just beginning to expand. They were hiring college graduates as administrative assistants.
So at what point did you start to manage money?
Yeah.
And at what point did you realize that this firm was interested in cultivating you as a leader?
So I started managing money in 1997. And so, every year from then, I began to manage more money. In 1999, I was able to run a biotech portfolio. In 2000, I was able to run a sleeve of the Hartford Healthcare Fund. And then the decade of the 2000s was really like honing those portfolio management skills. I will say I began my leadership journey right around the time I moved to London. So I moved my family to London in 2007 and 2008 as we began to globalize our investment platform. It was really about culture. It was also becoming more independent from my cocoon here in Boston. I'm from a very large family, a big Irish family. I had my life was planned out. I had social events all the time, barbecues here. So I actually do think moving to London, being alone with my small family unit, being away from the person I worked with for 16, 17 years, was the beginning of my leadership journey. And then I became managing partner in 2014.
You're still running the world's largest healthcare fund.
Yes.
How's that possible? Managing $46 billion with all the research and all the analysis that it takes to stay on top of such a complex industry, set of industries really, while also being the CEO, and while also being, I hasten to add, a mom to 4 daughters. How do you do that?
So everyone has super strengths, right? Everyone has super strengths. One of my super strengths is
your superpower.
A superpower is organization. If I wasn't as organized and sort of a superpower and processes, I think it would probably be impossible.
Everyone you meet in Port Harcourt has stories about what they call black soot, caused by the manufacturing and consumption of these fuel products in the illegal refineries.
Oil theft, known as bunkering, and the refining of its spoils is worsening the damage from decades of fossil fuel exploitation, creating one of the world's most severe ecological disasters.
Our sacred forests, our homes, have to give way to oil wells, and no one gets much benefit.
Imagine a resident of Port Harcourt who inhales this soot every second in 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30 days in the month, and for years now, we are dying slowly but surely, and our lifespan is reducing every day.
market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
We've talked about the virtues of being a private partnership. Have you ever wondered to yourself if Wellington would be better off as a public company?
No.
Why not?
Because I've followed public companies my whole career, and for a lot of public companies, you have to really focus on the public markets really force you to be more short-term focused. And it's more short-term focused than it was 15 or 20 years ago. And the best companies continue to operate with a long-term focus. Our private partnership just allows us to be long-term focused. The other question you would ask, what would ever make us go public? And it would probably be some dramatic change in the industry where we needed capital in a way we don't need today.
This company makes a lot of money, doesn't it?
We are in the asset management business, and if we do well and we generate alpha for our clients, it is a profitable business.
I was fishing for something a little bit different, which is along the lines of this. There aren't many publicly traded companies with assets under management in the neighborhood of Wellington's, only a handful.
Yeah.
But they make, those with a one handle on the trillions make somewhere between $1 and $3 billion a year in net income. Is that ballpark for Wellington too?
You're not going to get me there, Eric. It's a nice try. All I'll say is that we participate in the asset management industry. We have a similar costs, but we're not different. We're not the same as everyone else. We don't have the cost. We are an investment management business, so we earn a fee for managing the money. We're not a heavily distribution-oriented business. All of our compensation, though, is geared towards performance. So everyone at Wellington will do better if we perform for clients, and that's the key.
How do you decide who gets paid what?
So that's the other part of our partnership. The 3 managing partners, which I've been one since 2014, distribute or determine how the profits are split at the firm. So you have to imagine there has to be tremendous trust in the 3 managing partners, and that trust means I know they trust us to know what's going on in the business, who's having impact, that we're not going to play favorites, that we're going to be really fair. The path to partnership and the ability to become a partner at Wellington is a really critical part of our ability to attract talent.
Talent has always been one of the hardest, maybe the hardest problem to solve for in the investment business. And that was true before the pandemic, right? And the demands that it has created for flexibility and the demands that it has created for diversity. How hard is the talent problem now?
I think the pandemic has shown us, and it probably should show most companies, that it's not about buildings. It's about the culture. It's about shared values. In the future, we're going to be more flexible about where our talent sits.
How much of Wellington's success in the future depends on how well you integrate technology?
I think 5 years from now, we won't have a technology department. We'll have technologists will be integrated into running the business. And I'll give you some examples. We have portfolio construction tools. We have ways to screen. Each portfolio manager has a philosophy and process, and they have a tool that helps them screen based on that philosophy and process. We have these tools now that bring very qualitative things into a quantitative framework. We have our own internal risk portal. So how do you continue to make that a greater and greater? And we already talked about ESG and how much it's data oriented. How do you make that more and more part of the portfolio construction process? If we're in a more complex world, which I do believe we are in, a more complex investing world, where it's not just about revenues and earnings and PE, it's about this mosaic of things that are going to impact the value of a company or the value of that return, like what's the path of portfolio returns. Technology is going to play a bigger and bigger part of that.
There are a lot of asset managers.
Yeah.
Who do you think of as Wellington's main competition?
Well, I will say I've talked to quite a number of them in my new role as CEO, and I have a lot of respect for my peers. One observation would be that they're all a little bit different. right?
Sure.
They're all a little bit different. But if you look at over time, who has sort of a research process that's similar to us? Like I would say Capital Group, T. Rowe Price. I'm often in meetings with Capital and T. Rowe Price. You know, PIMCO on the fixed income side is probably a competitor that we highly respect and run into from a client perspective. Those would be a few examples. And then on the private side, it would be, you know, many small firms. And on the long short side.
Name 3 things you admire at rival firms and wish Wellington could do as well.
All right. Well, this is okay. Give me a minute to think about this. I think that if you look at BlackRock, they use their technology as an advantage to interact with clients. I don't think anyone really in that way can compete with them in terms of the competition with Aladdin. I think that is just very impressive. Capital Group and their distribution in the U.S., for example, they have a very strong relationship with broker-dealers in the U.S. I think that's also very impressive. If you look at some private firms, this is not so much direct competitors, but firms that have been around for 20 years. I think it's a real advantage if you've been on the private side, if you've been around for quite a long period of time. So obviously firms like Sequoia, they're not doing exactly what we're doing, but they just have sort of this, you know, I'm studying them quite a bit just because we're, you know, how do we be excellent in the privates business? And there's a few of them that have just done such a good job consistently over time. That's been very impressive.
Is growing this business important to you and to your fellow partners?
You know, we follow 5,000 companies. We're always analyzing how are companies relative to their competition and their peers. So we want to win, right? So we want to do well. I'm also a strong believer in you can't aspire to grow just for growth's sake. You have to be super focused on the inputs. And if you do really well on the inputs, you will grow as a firm. The leadership team, I think our partnership is very focused on that. Like if we have the right inputs, and that means, are we investing in talent? Are we investing in new capabilities? Are we expanding in areas that we think will help our clients? Then hopefully we will, and we can deliver performance, we will grow.
Let's talk about the legacy that you're in the process of defining. When your colleagues and your clients look back on the Jean Hines era as CEO, they'll say you accomplished what?
That we've continued to hire amazing talent. We have made our collaborative investment ecosystem stronger, and that we have been a firm that's growing, so we've been able to expand the partnership, and that we are delivering, most importantly, we're delivering great outcomes to clients. And maybe finally, it's more about can I do what the previous CEOs have done and figure out ways to strengthen Wellington so that we have another 40, 50 years, the next set of CEOs can continue, that I'm just passing through and a steward of this firm that, you know, my almost 40 years here, whatever I retire, that I will know know that this firm will be very strong for the next 50 years.
Jean, thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric.
I really enjoyed our time.
Companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
Inflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
You could trade anything as a trend fall.
When you think about Bitcoin, I don't think it's a currency. I think it's a commodity.
Today, we're in an everything bubble.
I'm Francine Lacqua. Welcome to Bloomberg Front Row. Andrea Orcel is a titan of European banking. At UBS, he transformed the firm's investment bank. He's now the chief executive of major Italian lender Unicredit. Over the course of his career, Orcel has had to navigate numerous crises, and now is no different as the world grapples with the most serious conflict in Europe since World War II, rampant inflation and aggressive central bank tightening.
Inflation is biting. We see for low-income or lower-income families really difficult to deal with the rising cost of energy.
The Italian has also faced personal challenges recently, including a dramatic and public legal battle with Santander over their botched attempt to hire him as chief executive.
I will always be sorry for how it went. This is another bank I admire a lot, and that hasn't changed. I think for me, it was more about confirming the facts. It was obviously an emotional roller coaster. I think from a family standpoint, it was quite impactful.
In his first TV interview since becoming chief executive, we talk about his new role at Unicredit, the impact of the war in Ukraine, the challenges of being Europe's bank, and that Santander debacle. Here's my conversation with Andrea Orcel. Andrea Orcel, thank you so much for speaking to Bloomberg. So you've been in the job just over a year. Was it everything you hoped for?
More.
Really?
Much more, yes.
Not stressful?
Stressful, but I like stressful. I think that what has been great this year is the way Unicredit really welcomed me into the organization. Mm-hmm. It was full of passion, full of warmth, and you feel the energy of the people around you. People that want a new vision, a new strategy, a new direction, and that are ready to commit and own the future. It was absolutely outstanding.
Did that surprise you? Were you expecting a more sleepy bank?
No, but I looked at it more from the perspective of a banker, numbers, what needs to be done, where is the value, where is not the value. But when you arrive, you see the people, and that makes the whole difference.
So that's what makes it more emotional, I guess? Is this like
probably. Somebody asked me once, what keeps you up at night? Well, the emotions are now very engaged, and you feel a duty and a commitment to the people who are looking up at you to take them in a certain direction. And that, I think, puts a lot of weight on your shoulders.
Unicredit's exposure to Russia is one of the top 3 in Europe. How do you deal with the employees in Russia, with your subsidiary in Russia?
Well, first of all, for us, it's important to understand that we have to remember that 95% of the bank is not in Russia. Yeah. And we cannot commit the mistake of spending the entire time on Russia, where our emotion and the shock that we have taken is probably driving us to do. So what we have done is we have a situation room that is fully committed to do that, with all the skill sets that we need, from legal to tax to accounting to everything else. And they work on managing our exposure towards Russia. The rest of the team is 105% or 110% focused on running the rest of the equation. When I look at Russia, separating it, there are 2 orders of effects that we look at. One is the direct shock from our exposure to Russia. I think that in the last 2 months, we have achieved to reduce it meaningfully by about 2 billion. We've done that. Actually, the team has done a great job without that costing the bank almost anything, which was not to be expected. And at the same time, we have understood very well and in a granular way what the risks are. And we think that in Q1, we took a very conservative set of provisions to try and insulate ourselves the most possible from the further effect from a degeneration of that situation.
The provisions were quite large, and the market took it quite well. Is that how you would describe it?
I think so. I think what we did is, during those 2 months, we were able to articulate in a detailed way what is our extreme loss scenario for Russia, converted in numbers on hit on capital. It's about 130 basis points of capital. And in the first quarter, we took about 195 to be exact.
The question is now what you do with this unit. Are you frustrated that you keep on getting asked over and over what will happen to Russia and the employees there?
Well, I think that anyone who has a large presence in Russia or a significant presence in Russia is being asked. It's normal. I think we believe strongly that let us show you what we execute and let's talk about it then. Because at this point in time, while we have reviewed the situation, we have a number of options that we could pursue. The options are very much affected by the next wave of sanction, by who are the counterparts, what we can do, what we cannot do. And at the same time, we should not forget that we do have 4,000 employees in Russia. We do have 1,500 corporate clients. And what people sometimes forget is that 1,250 are actually Europeans who are trying to go through the same thing that we're going through as a bank, which is deal with the situation in the best way possible.
Do you have a preferred route? And actually, is there a situation where you just say, like, we need to get rid of it? What do you say to the critics that say, Andrea, you should have gotten rid of this, whatever the cost?
I think our view is, number one, my preferred route is not necessarily a route that can be executed. In the same way that we have given detail of how much of our cross-border exposure we have reduced, we could have reduced a lot more if it wasn't for successive waves of sanctions that have closed the window on who we can deal with, what transaction can we do, and in which timing. The same applies to our local presence. The solution very much depends on what is allowed to be done by a complex web of sanctions that we have and by who are our counterparties. We believe very strongly that if we want to be consistent with what the EU has decided, we need to consider all the options in a way that they reflect fair value, because this is a primary objective for not providing too much value to the counterpart, let's put it this way, but is not justified, and at the same time balancing what is in the best interest of our stakeholder and investors.
How worried are you about inflation, about the cost of living? You're so tied to the Italian economy, and this is an economy in terms of energy, in terms of also exports and imports with Russia, that's one of the most closely linked.
Well, we are tied to the Italian economy. We're less than people expect because we are about 40% of a bank. I think in my first year of operation, being tied to the Italian economy has been great. Good growth, good dynamics, stable direction of travel.
Is that the Draghi effect?
It is the Draghi effect. As we look forward, there will be a deceleration. We have two central scenarios for ourselves. One is a significant slowdown, and the other one is a deep recession. At the moment, we see a significant slowdown as the central scenario, although Europe has not been affected at all by spillover effects beyond prices. So what we're seeing is inflation being the precursor of more. Inflation is biting. We see for low-income or lower-income families really difficult to deal with the rising cost of energy. We also see that for companies that had investments or that were dependent on energy or on grain to a certain extent, the whole value chain has been completely destroyed. And so they need to reassess what is their position, change their sources, redesign their models. But at this point in time, this translates solely in a slowdown of investment. We haven't seen anything else. We do believe that going forward, it will be a lot more disruptive.
The Indian city of Jamnagar is a money-making machine for Asia's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. His company Reliance has the world's biggest oil refinery complex here in the city. Jamnagar is also where Ambani is making his newest bet, a $10 billion investment in green energy. His ambition is closely aligned with the Indian government's plan to reach net zero emissions by 2070. But Ambani is not alone. India's second richest man, Gautam Adani, has committed $20 billion of investment over the next decade. But India's massive dependencies on fossil fuels have some environmental advocates questioning the realism and sincerity of those green ambitions and those of its two biggest billionaires.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Do you worry about a policy mistake from the ECB? If you have this possible recessionary environment and they don't raise rates, what happens to inflation and what happens to all of your Italian clients or European clients?
Well, it's a very tricky economic environment for the ECB, but also in the US. Yeah. Because on the one hand, you have inflation, but the inflation is generated by a specific segment of the economy, i.e. energy. I'm not that sure that raising rates a lot will cool that down because it's very concentrated and it is linked to a dislocation between offer and demand. The rest of the economy, however, we all agree that is slowing down and maybe tilting into recession. Raising rates creates an issue. So it's very, very tricky to manage. And yes, we're all concerned to finding the right balance. I think that getting to a more neutral stance towards the zero is probably okay. The moment you go up a lot from there, it depends very much on what the rest of the economy is doing.
I mean, we also have this widening spread between Italian BTPs and German bonds. How much of a worry is that?
Well, you always have a bit of that every time that there is a crisis, there is a so-called flight to quality, and that happens. I think that, like for many other things, we need to see how all the economies of Europe are going to perform, in fact, during this environment. And I think what I was telling investors the other day is if you look at Europe today, and we are 5 months into the year, you do not see any deceleration of the economy. You see inflation, you see a rise in rates, you see some very worrying sign, you anticipate a social and an economic impact from the war, but you're not seeing yet that kind of degeneration that the market is expecting.
What is the market looking at? I mean, this is like the market seems to be all over the place. We could be up, we could be down. Are we living through a correction?
Well, I think I read an interesting report from one of the organizations that covers us, that will remain unnamed here, but that was asked to do a parallel between the environment of today and the 70s on inflation, which tells you what kind of mood and worry exists out there. Personally, I don't think it's going to be that extreme because I think there are a number of amortizers. I mean, if you look at the facts, Italy has managed to redistribute or change the origin of its energy to a significant extent of its value chain. So we now go to Algeria, Azerbaijan, and other places to get a lot of the gas, or we will be going. If you look at Poland, they have found a way to deal with Norway. If you look at Bulgaria, they connected their pipes towards Greece and the gas that arrives from there. So Europe is adjusting. The question is how much time there is, but Europe is adjusting.
But adjusting is in a kind of earthquake way, because you could see if there's oil and gas embargo from Russia, what happens to this continent?
I think it depends on timing. That's why the economic environment that we're looking at, it depends on timing and extent of the breakage away from Russia and to a certain extent from Ukraine. If that is done very fast and completely, as you said, the impact will be quite dramatic. If that is done over a significant longer period of time, the impact will be less dramatic. Do we have a significantly longer period of time. I don't know. But that is the key. And we always talk about gas, but we also need to understand our dependence on other commodities, nickel, palladium, lithium, a whole of other things that the entire value chain was predicated on connections with Russia and grains, connections with Ukraine. And if that changes from one day to the other, the shock is very high.
You were talking about a political stability in Italy. We were joking about the Draghi effect. Do you worry that actually politics in Italy has always been quite messy, that this political instability comes back and hurts your bank?
Well, politics in Italy, if you're Italian, I'm Italian, are politics in Italy, but forever, Italians have been able to go through it. And I have a lot of trust in the country, and I believe the country has evolved in a certain way. And in a way, I am much more nervous about the more general impact on economy in Europe, the more general social impact on on Europe, immigration, things like that, that are going to touch not only Italy, but the broader continent.
How much do you like taking care of risk? So I want to talk about, a little bit about what you're doing inside UniCredit. Do you feel like you're a risk manager? Is it about also cutting costs? How do you have one of the most generous plans actually for investors out there. How will you stick to it?
Well, I think, how will we stick to it? I think we have said very clearly that we felt that the execution of UniCredit Unlocked would yield to a certain level of profitability, a certain level of organic capital generation. Based on that, we could have very generous distribution to our shareholders.
Was that pre-Russia?
That was pre-Russia. So effectively, the plan anticipated that our capital will remain stable through the period at the top end of our peer group, and that we would distribute only the excess capital we would generate every year. So in that way, it is prudent. It is subordinated to us executing the plan and all of its levers. At the same time, because of where we're coming from, there is a lot of value to be created. So that is what generates the distribution that we have. Then we get to the invasion of Ukraine. At the moment, what we have done is we have changed our macro scenario of reference from what it was before to a slowdown. From a GDP standpoint, it brings about 2 to 2.5 points lesser GDP growth than we were anticipating. From an inflation standpoint, it takes to a couple of percentage point more inflation than we were anticipating, with peaks in certain countries, obviously. In that environment, we can still execute, let's say, the UniCredit Unlocked plan as it is, if we keep our eyes on the ball and execute as we should be. Because on a way, the GDP deceleration is in part compensated by higher rates, which are good for banks like us.
When you think of cutting-edge technology at sea, you might be thinking of stuff like this. But there's an incoming revolution on the high seas that isn't quite as sexy, but could be significantly more impactful.
Container shipping is the key component of global trade. About 80 or 90% of all the world's goods are transported at sea at some point.
But there's a significant unseen cost to the modern era of global commerce.
About 3% of all the world's CO2 emissions come from shipping.
3% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly comparable to the entire CO2 output of Germany. Since reducing trade isn't a likely option, what about a technological improvement to help reduce the emissions from these well-stocked maritime behemoths?
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
had one of the most colorful careers. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it. I don't know how you would describe it, but certainly in the 5 years, it's not been dull or boring following your career moves. Do you feel vindicated that you were awarded that amount of money with what happened with Santander?
I think I will always be sorry for how it went. This is another bank I admire a lot, and that hasn't changed. I think for me, it was more about confirming the facts, confirming the truths that I knew existed, and that has been done, and it's uncontroversial. I mean, you will find it black over white through the process that has happened. That, for me, was very important because a number of stories were written at the time. What happens then, I mean, obviously Santander has appealed, we'll see. But for me, the important point was that the truth is there, the facts are there, and at least mentally, I have moved on.
I mean, your case is probably studied in universities, eh? Because people want to know how they're paid. You know, I think 68 million without never starting a job, but also to try and understand what labor laws and everything like that works. Do you think it's changed the way we look at banking laws and banking?
I don't know if it has changed. What I know is that we shouldn't forget that banking is a highly regulated industry. As a result of that, senior jobs have a very large component of deferral in their compensation. In the UK, it's 7 years. And more than 50%, if not 60 in certain cases, of your compensation is deferred over 7 years. If you do the math, that means that at every point in time, you're going to have between 3-4x of your compensation deferred. And that is indexed to the share price of the bank where you are. And if it goes up, those 3-4x becomes even more. The difficulty is when you change organizations, what do? You either have a new organization that assumes that deferral, or you don't move. Because in effect, that deferral is your entire savings. So I do think that although these are large numbers, they need to be put in context of how they got there. Usually, in most cases, in all cases, the organization who hires assumes that liability or deferral. So that number is that liability and deferral, is plus a few other things that occurred because of the case, but that is what it is.
Was it an emotional roller coaster? Is it something that you've put behind, or is something that you don't think about?
Well, at the beginning, it was obviously an emotional roller coaster. I think from a family standpoint, it was quite impactful, and I think personally, given the esteem I had for that bank, it was quite impactful. I think the important point was once I went through the preparation of the case, I detached and I left other people deal with it, and I was quite fortunate that those people were excellent. And then I trusted the process. A lot of people told me not to trust the process, but I did, and it ended up being worthwhile.
Andrea, talk to me a little bit about your working from home policy. So do you think COVID has changed everything? Is it problematic for a bank to let people work from home?
Let's say that what COVID has done, both from the standpoint of clients and from the standpoint of employees, is more remote, more agile, more flexible. I think that is not a bad thing. I think it has taken away FaceTime. To a certain extent, I believe strongly that being at work is important. That's how you establish the culture. That's how you train people. That's how teams can interact with each other and brainstorm and come up with a good idea. On the other hand, and we had started to do something similar at UBS at the time, you need to give people the flexibility to organize their lives, and you cannot say it's 9 to 5 or it's whatever it is, and that is it. So if you allow that flexibility for people to organize their lives, and if they need to take a Friday morning and then see the soccer match of their children, and then work longer on the Friday evening, that's their choice. But I don't think you can replace human interaction, brainstorming, teamwork. If you look at the agile way of developing our new initiatives around IT, They come from representative from business, technology, compliance, risk, all being in one room. And instead of saying you do pieces, how do we resolve the mortgage product? You can do that in the office. You can't do that remote.
Talk to me about attracting talent. So do you worry about some of the bright young minds going to JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs because they pay more? Or do you worry about them going to crypto or Google because it's exciting?
Well, I think what I have found is that the bright minds are as attracted by money as they are, and probably more, by what's the vision, what's the challenge, what do I learn? Is this company doing things that I am proud of? Do they care for the environment? Do they care for the communities? Will I be followed in my career and developed, which is why we just launched the UniCredit University. These things, especially in the early years, take quite a lot of space in their decision. As they move through, and they come in and they move through, then what takes place is how do you treat them? How do you track their career, manage their career? Do you give them opportunity? That's why I think we're very fortunate at UniCredit. I can have a young person from Bosnia who starts in the leading bank in Bosnia, does a tour into Austria, Italy, Germany, Serbia, and then with a skill set that has been refined, goes back and leads the bank in Bosnia. Not many groups can do that. And I think that's one of the attractions that we have.
What do you like most about being chief executive?
Trying to make a difference. I have been told by many people that, no, this cannot be done, or this is difficult. This is a little bit my chance to try and do what I think it's right. What I think it's right is usually I get it from talking to people who, and if I can make a difference to UniCredit and to the 80,000 people that are there and look back and say, yeah, I helped move it from here to here, and I helped establish what are our principles, what we stand for, I think that will be a win.
If the Credit Suisse chief executive job came up, would you be up for it?
I love UniCredit too much.
Andrea, thank you so much.
Thank you, Francine.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
But ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds. However you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
Who's my guest this week? It's the former senior White House advisor, Fiona Hill. It was one of the most compelling appearances during the Trump impeachment hearings. Blunt, composed, and incredibly distinctive with her strong Northern English accent. President Trump's top Russia expert was devastating in her assessment of policy and culture in Trump's White House. Her warning about Putin's danger to the West and how American ideals that were so appealing to her were under threat.
Putin is always looking out to see if there is any hint that we will not follow through on promises that we have made, because he will always follow through on a threat.
Fiona Hill's journey from a poor English mining town to working for 3 presidents in Washington is documented in her book, There Is Nothing For You Here, where she takes her story of social mobility and opportunity and argues that class and racial barriers are still holding too many back. Here's a bit of what's coming up.
And imagine if Trump had actually succeeded on January 6th, and the members of the January 6th committee in the US Congress are pretty convinced that we were very close to him succeeding, had not Vice President Pence basically refused to block the transfer of executive power. I mean, we'd be in a totally different place. I mean, Vladimir Putin would have probably just, driven right into Ukraine himself.
Fiona, thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
Thanks, Anna.
Today.
Great to be with you.
Really interested to hear what you have to say, especially because for a lot of people, they wouldn't have heard of you before that first impeachment inquiry in which you appeared. And I wonder, for you, do you replay that moment? Do you think about it? And what do you think about?
I actually don't. I mean, maybe that sounds a little bit strange, but it was it's one of those things where you're so focused in the moment that when you come out again, it's almost like it didn't happen, because it was such an intense period of concentration, a lot of effort leading up to it. And then, the kind of aftermath was sort of moving on to the next thing, because so much happened as a consequence of that I hadn't anticipated, that I find it very kind of hard looking back to it.
I find it fascinating in your book you talk about this, being prepared for the room, that it was going to be quite cold, and also how you looked as a woman. All these things had to be factored in when I'm sure you just wanted to give the information.
Exactly. I mean, I didn't know I'd have to think about this. I mean, literally, one of the very first questions was, we're going to have to figure out what you're going to wear. And I thought, what? And I said, well, does that happen to men? And they said, well, not so much. But the point is that as a woman, people are already wondering who you are. And they literally said to me, you don't want to be a distraction from the truth. And the reason I wanted to put this in the book is that, look, most times when men write a book, nobody asks them about how it is to be a man. Nobody even kind of thinks about what it is that they were wearing, or, in a particular setting. And, they just go there and they do their job. I mean, yes, if you're going to appear on television, everybody now these days with high-definition TV has to have, some makeup on their head and, otherwise they look like they've died. kind of just the whole bright lights effect. But for something as serious and consequential as a testimony, I thought the whole fact that there was focus on how I would look as part of my presenting myself so that people would listen to my answers and just for telling the truth. I mean, that really hit me, and thought about, what a difference it really is to be a woman in these kinds of settings.
And what did you do? How did you make sure you were listened to in terms of how you looked? And then how did you feel? Did you have to wear extra layers? Did you have to take the advice?
I did, and I had a really good PR person, a woman that I've mentioned in the book called Molly Levinson, who did this for a living and had been in the broadcast media as well as a producer, but who had worked with people in these kinds of settings for a long period of time. And she literally went through my wardrobe. She said, you have to look. A particular look, she said, that will be picked up by the Washington Post style section. Well, that look was when we were picked up by the Washington Post Stars section, which I was pretty incredulous about at the beginning, they said we were reassuringly dull. So that was what she was looking for, because I was basically testifying with another person, David Holmes from the US Embassy in Kiev.
Did he look reassuringly
Well, I thought he looked quite smart, actually. But the whole view was, reassuringly dull bureaucrat look.
There was a Fiona Hill fan club that sort of sprung up online, actually from across the spectrum in some ways, as people heard what you had to say and stayed. A lot of people talking about how focused you stayed on the facts. And some of those almost we'll get to through your expertise. But did you feel it was a good use of your time, or do you feel it was a waste of your time? Because ultimately it didn't work. I had John Bolton on, the former national security advisor to Trump, very recently, and he didn't testify because he thought it would be a waste of time.
It depends on what your perspective is about, waste of time or good use of time. In the United States, there is still this concept of civics education, where people fully understand how their government works, and especially important in something like a representative democracy, a liberal democracy, where you as the regular person wants to feel that your public servants, your members of Congress, your members of Parliament, are actually taking your interests into consideration and listening to you. And understanding that there are checks and balances on executive power, particularly on abuses of power, which this was, clearly the case, and, this whole definition of crimes and misdemeanors, and how does this process play out? It was an exercise in liberal democracy. It's the checks and the balance, the oversight of Congress.
But ultimately it didn't work.
Yeah, but it showed people that the system was there, and that everybody got to hear the truth. And I think a lot of people came away from that realising that it was wrong for basically Donald Trump to ask Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, for a personal favour. Now, the political outcome of this, the partisan political outcome of this, was, of course, that there was no censure even of Trump. He didn't get any kind of penalty. It wasn't even a rap on the knuckles or the wrist, from any perspective. And as Ambassador Bolton, John Bolton, said, well, look, it seemed to be a waste of time. If anybody was really expecting there to be some massive outcome for Trump himself, I think it actually also emboldened him to go on to the next thing that he got impeached twice for.
Were there any negative outcomes for you being out there and effectively going viral?
Oh, there was a lot. I mean, there was all kinds of misogyny and sexism and threats and, threats of bodily harm and, kind of all kinds of threats.
How did they come to you?
Mostly through the internet. So I just stopped engaging. I mean, my sister, who was constantly monitoring Twitter and Facebook and things, would, give me warnings, and she would get in touch with the platforms to try to get people to take down some of the, most outrageous things. I'd get phone calls, letters, emails. But actually, I have to say that it was a smaller percentage than what was really an overwhelming, I would say, positive response in terms of just, thank you for telling the truth. And again, everybody can tell the truth. So I didn't think it was that extraordinary. And, again, there was a lot of other people who did testify, my colleagues, that people have got to know as well. And, I really took away from that there was a kind of a great thirst for people just standing up there and telling things like they are.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Everyone you meet in Port Harcourt has stories about what they call black soot, caused by the manufacturing and consumption of these fuel products in the illegal refineries.
Oil theft, known as bunkering, and the refining of its spoils is worsening the damage from decades of fossil fuel exploitation, creating one of the world's most severe ecological disasters.
Our sacred forests, our homes, have to give way to
oil wells, and no one gets much benefit.
Imagine a resident of Port Harcourt who inhales this soot every second in 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30 days in the month, and for years now, we are dying slowly but surely, and our lifespan is reducing every day.
Talking about what you know and your expertise, of course, it's Russia, and it's hugely in demand right now. And I wanted to talk about Ukraine from the perspective of all you have looked at and all you're looking at right now. Do you think the conflict, the war, was inevitable?
I don't, actually. I mean, I think there's all kinds of junctures along the way in everything where, things can take a different path. I think that what happened in terms of the decision-making of Vladimir Putin is he thought, there was a number of things going on. First of all, he thought the West had lost the plot, that we'd become very weak and distracted, that indeed all we're doing is engaging with partisan and fights with each other, identity politics, you name it. But he saw over a long period of time an inability for the West to stand up to its own values and its own principles, particularly when it came to pressure on other countries. So Ukraine was in the crosshairs, going back to, in fact, the early 2000s and even back into the 1990s. And we didn't really do anything. Same when Georgia was invaded back in 2008. Each time we'd find an excuse and not really take very strong measures. I also think that 2 years of COVID had an impact. Like the rest of us, he was kind of sitting down, hunkered down, excluding, people from coming close to him, not wanting to get sick. But he also became more and more isolated, we could see, from the people who used to get access to him. So he starts to be basically shrunk down in his terms of advice to a smaller and smaller group of people. And clearly he convinced himself that he could get away with this and that there would be no backlash either in Ukraine or anywhere else in the West.
But do you think, for instance, you've mentioned a whole series of events leading up to this. But, for instance, there are some now saying that the presidency of Trump and the attack on January the 6th on the Capitol was a moment, a particular moment. Did you buy into that?
From Putin's point of view, yes. Exactly. I mean, look, the United States looks like it was finished. And imagine if Trump had actually succeeded on January 6th and the members of the January 6th committee in the US Congress are pretty convinced that we were very close to him succeeding, had not Vice President Pence basically refused to block the transfer of executive power and had agreed, in fact, to just go ahead, or pushed ahead rather than agreed to it. I mean, disagreed with what Trump was asking him to do and had, basically certified the electoral votes. I mean, we'd be in a totally different place. I mean, Vladimir Putin would have probably just, driven right into Ukraine himself, because he then would have seen the United States as completely finished from a leadership perspective, because we would be no different from any other country in the world that had just had a coup.
How concerned are you about nuclear conflict at this moment in time?
Well, I'm very concerned about some one-sided action on the part of Putin, and I think it's very important for all of us to put that into a context and not be intimidated by it, because that's exactly what he wants to do. Putin wants to take us all back to the 1980s and the Euro missile crisis and war scares, or back to the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where everyone's thinking they've got to duck and cover again. Putin is a kind of a free agent, maverick when it comes to this. He's sort of, in a way, revived the Soviet-era instruments of nuclear missiles and biological and chemical weapons. He's already used chemical weapons with Novichok and polonium, here in the United Kingdom, in assassination attempts, for example. During the Syrian war, after the Russians intervened, there was lots of chemical, weapons attacks, lots of threats of all kinds of things going. And just by rhetorically putting out there the prospect that he might use a nuclear weapon, talking about the chances that he might use a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon, he's trying to get us all scared so that we back off and then basically agree to surrender Ukraine or whatever else it is that he's demanding.
Do you not believe it then? I suppose
I believe that he's thinking about doing it, but I think that what we need to do is to push back against that, because we need to understand why he's doing it. He's doing it because he feels on the back foot right now. He hasn't been able to press forward with the aims in the way that he wanted them, politically and then militarily. And he's doing it because he figures we're going to get scared.
So how do you do this with him? I mean, you talk as if, right, we need to understand him. You're giving some of the expertise that you've got, the intelligence as well that you will have heard about. But how do you negotiate with Putin?
Well, what you have to do is get a full court press on him here, because look, Putin wants this all to be about just his discussions with Biden or just his discussions with, kind of the West, because again, Ukraine is one of the objects here, and the other object is rolling back NATO and getting rid of the United States in European affairs. But what he's doing has global consequences. And we need China, we need India, we need other countries to push back. Japan and South Korea get it. And I mean, they've been very much supportive, but we need to get more than that. We need to be able to show the rest of the world that this has global consequences. And this isn't just an East-West spat, but it's just not possible to keep moving forward. Denying components to the Russian military for the war, not just giving more weapons to Ukraine, problems of accessing the funding, basically making, heading him off at every pass. But diplomatically, if he's hearing it from not just the NATO countries, not just the West, not just the sort of usual suspects, but quietly from others saying, look, what you're doing here is having terrible consequences for us as well. Famine in Africa, kind of really putting on edge security elsewhere in the world. That's when we might have a chance of pushing this in a different direction.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
I suppose what you're talking about there is leadership and who's going to be doing that and if they're doing that. And you have worked for 3 presidents, but only known by one as Russia bitch. Were you actually known as that?
Apparently. I mean, I didn't know that in real time. I learned that later from an American journalist who was doing some interviews for a piece afterwards.
And this was how
I was not surprised.
Were referred to by Donald Trump?
Well, by some of the people around him. I don't know whether he himself ever said that. I don't think so.
I think that gives a window, though, into the climate within which you were working, especially as an expert on Russia and as a woman.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's just that kind of casual misogyny. Who does she think she is, that woman who works on Russia? I mean, it's kind of obvious. I mean, I wasn't the slightest bit surprised when I heard that. I mean, I was a bit surprised that I thought the particular person this was a tribute to, I hadn't even noticed who I was. So I thought, oh, well, I guess they did know who I was.
I wonder, because of what you're saying here, were you actually listened to by Donald Trump?
I don't think he listened to anybody. But apart from, people who we saw as peers. I mean, that's why, we saw in weirdness in real time of him, with Putin talking about Putin being strong and powerful, and he was listening to Putin over his intelligence chiefs, for example, at the summit at Helsinki in that dreadful press conferences. We knew that he listened to people on Fox News and on other, media outlets. Many of the people, including Ambassador Bolton and others, would try to get on the Sunday shows because they knew that he would be watching. They were more likely to have him listen to them if they were on the TV screen than he would listen if he was in the Oval Office. And there's all that kind of bizarre, creativity that had to go on to get his attention. Because if you went in and you sat down, you were just his staff. So he basically projected.
But that sounds like it's men and women, or would you say it was worse for women?
I think it was worse for women, but not all women. I mean, there were some women that he respected and listened to, like Kellyanne Conway and his daughter Ivanka Trump. But once a person started working for him, no matter what they'd been before, that status disappeared. I mean, he projected onto the government the same style, I presume, that he had in his private business when it was, the Trump family enterprises, and that everyone was then the staff. So why would he listen to them? I mean, in that context, information and recommendations and direction trickled down from him, not up. You know, if you're an eponymous family firm, it's your brand, your firm, you just tell other people, you know, what to do. In the case of the US government, they're supposed to be much more, you know, advisors are supposed to be advised. The National Security Advisor knows their stuff. They're supposed to be able to have a say in this. They're coordinating all the way across the government. And as far as Trump was concerned, we were all some version of staff. When he, you know, if you were called Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, you were just a glorified secretary. If you were a woman, you were pretty likely to be a regular secretary.
I mean, how did you take this in your stride? Did it get to you? I know you'd been on the Women's March and then you accepted this job because you wanted to contribute, you know, and put something back and help.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't deluded in that sense. I mean, what I think really did get to me was just the dirty politics. Because again, I'm not a partisan person. I'm politically engaged, politically active, but I'm not political. I've never been on a political campaign. And just this, you know, Game of Thrones, you know, kind of people stabbing each other in the back. I mean, yeah, it happens in every political system. But there's just the dirty corruption behind the scenes as well. I did really genuinely think that people would understand on the national security front that, you know, you needed to check all of that, that when it came to certain issues, really critical issues where American lives were at stake or the whole stability of the globe, let's put it that way, the people would check themselves. But I was shocked to find they didn't, and that's what got to me.
But you also said that, you know, being groped in the 70s and 80s, working in a golf club, had been preparation, good preparation for working in the White House.
I would have preferred not to have that. And actually, let's just be very clear, nobody did that to me in the White House. But, you know, just when you had that experience...
As a context, is an extraordinary piece of help almost that you cited when working in this particular
I mean, that
White
was
House.
kind of the weird thing of, you know, growing up as a, you know, a girl in, you know, 1970s, 1980s Britain, you know, kind of dominated by Benny Hill and, you know, raunchy postcards at the seaside and just all the things that kind of come with that. Nobody even thinks about it, just think it's very funny. Whereas you're a young girl, it's actually not very funny. But, you know, you just learn to have to laugh about it. This is so, you know, pre-Me Too that, you know, it seems like another world, and yet we still get all of that misogyny and sexism. There was, you know, a dress code inside of the White House. Was, you know, kind of very much, you know, Fox News, if anyone's seen the film Bombshell. I mean, I thought that was actually, would have been good preparation for watching before I kind of went in there. You know, and I was always aware that I had to, you know, change the way I dressed somewhat just so I blend in so that nobody would, you know, pay too much attention. And one of the, you know, the funniest episodes came when, you know, he thought I was a secretary and I was told by a senior colleague, you know, look, just don't worry about that. You know, he'll forget who you are. You know, you didn't imprint, but if you wear the same dress, he'll remember you. Just make sure that every time you go in, wear a different dress. So I had to actually get quite a wardrobe of different dresses.
It's a theme we seem to be returning to.
It's basically like, you know, some kind of camouflage, you know. It's like I'll wear my jungle camouflage today or my forest camouflage or my snow camouflage. It's just so that, you know, I can just get in there, try to do my job and get out again.
And I'm presuming this was different to working under Obama.
Yeah, I mean, nobody ever kind of went, but, you know, that was the sort of theme then when I get to the impeachment as well. Nobody there, you know, gave me a dress code. Actually, I looked back in some of the pictures there, I thought, what the heck was I wearing? But anyway, I found it actually quite funny because it was almost like being in, you know, some endless school play where you've got the various costume. And I guess I was just trying to be a tree, you know, kind of when I got into the Oval Office, just so that nothing untoward would happen.
I'm now imagining you in the
I know exactly the tree thing, you know, the kid in the tree. Hey, Mum, hey, Dad, I'm a tree.
Well,
but,
I should say the corner, in the oval.
Yeah, exactly. Potted plant.
I've not been in there myself.
Yeah.
But
there are no trees in the Oval. They're usually outside in the Rose Garden.
Right,
but the whole point of all that was, you know, get in there without any incident, but really focus on engaging with the other counterparts. I never got treated like that by the National Security team or the National Security Advisor. It was just this weird, you know, coterie around, and it was weird. It was like being in Alice in Wonderland as well. I know so many analogies. I do feel that, you know, strange things in my childhood, like reading Alice in Wonderland, Alice Through the Looking Glass and other things, prepared me better than all of the years of fancy educations and degrees. Although it was very important to obviously know Russian and know your stuff. But for those moments, that wasn't the best preparation.
And it isn't a past some point from your point of view. This was the administration. You would have worked for any administration. Your point is you wanted to bring your expertise, but this was how you found this particular administration.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that education. It's a key part of what you've written about, your journey from the coal house, as you put it, to the White House. And worryingly, in your journey, which you know, there are lots of bits of luck as well. You know, the particular time you were born, the education that was then available. You really talk about the fact you don't think it's getting better. In fact, it's getting worse, that social mobility, not just in the UK, you've looked at it through the prism of the US as well, is worse.
It is. It's got much worse over time, exactly right. I mean, the kind of opportunities that I had, including in the UK, for basically having my education, going to university paid for, I mean, those have all shrunk. There's just a lot less funding out there. I mean, there's been an expansion of places, but a lot less funding for people. And just that threat of enormous debt is really too much for people. Thinking and contemplating that. In the United States, what you think is the land of opportunity, anyone can make it. There's only a 5% chance now, very different from what it was in the late 1980s, to do what I've done in terms of going from the bottom 1% to the top 1% kind of thing. And everybody should have an opportunity, to be able to move forward in life. It doesn't have to be an elite education, but, to get the kind of job that they want, get the qualifications that they need as well. And we need to really think about that. I mean, there's been a lot of movement forward on socioeconomic background, on race and on gender, class to some degree here in the UK. I mean, in the United States, class gets subsumed by race in many contexts. But in terms of regional differentiation, that's not the case. I mean, I still see a huge divide in the United Kingdom between North and South. I've just been up north to see, my mother and family and friends. And it just seems like, London is a total world apart. And it's the same, for people in different boroughs in London. The city couldn't be no more different from Tower Hamlets and things like this, for example. And in the United States, it's very similar as well. People from, what we now call the Rust Belt, we used to be the old industrial heartland of the United States, feel that they might live on another planet, as have these affiliations and affinities with Washington, D.C. That's why January 6th happened. That's why people stormed the Capitol. The Capitol, the White House is the people's house, it's supposed to be the people's house, but the Capitol is supposed to be their symbol of representative democracy, and yet people saw it as a citadel, a kind of a forbidding fortress that wasn't representing them anymore. And just this kind of, this upsurge and this insurgency. I watched that and I thought, oh my God, look where we've got to here. That's the kind of epitome of these kinds of problems, when people feel that they're excluded in some way, and that sense of representation is broken down.
And you talk in some detail about some of the things you think need to change at the heart of it, education, but also what others can do when they do have positions of power and influence. I've got to ask, what does your mum make of your journey?
Well, I think she's a bit bemused by it, but she's pretty pleased at the same time. But it's funny, like, she took it all in a stride. I mean, I talk in the book about, when I was out looking for that suit that I wore at the impeachment. My mum's just, sees a sales rack and sees this suit, and she's, Fiona, come over here. Look, there's a suit for sale. Do you need it for that impeachment thingy? She didn't even, kind of fully connect about, what it was. And she just thought it was a great thing that I, went there and told the truth and, did my job. She wasn't passing, the big historical implications of that. She just saw it. My mum was a very practical person, a former midwife. If a baby needed delivering in, some difficult circumstances, off she would go and just do it without thinking about all the larger context. She just get on with it.
Well, you seem to have adopted a similar style. Thank you very much for talking to me and to all of us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Emma. Thank you.
And thank you to you for being with us. Until we meet again, take care and goodbye.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
The Indian city of Jamnagar is a money-making machine for Asia's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. His company Reliance has the world's biggest oil refinery complex here in the city. Jamnagar is also where Ambani is making his newest bet, a $10 billion investment in green energy. His ambition is closely aligned with the Indian government's plan to reach net zero emissions by 2070. But Ambani is not alone. India's second richest man, Gautam Adani, has committed $20 billion of investment over the next decade. But India's massive dependencies on fossil fuels have some environmental advocates questioning the realism and sincerity of those green ambitions and those of its two biggest billionaires.
So who's my guest this week? It's the inventor of the World Wide Web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee. When it comes to computer science, it doesn't get much bigger than inventing the web. Not many developments have had such an impact on the way we live, and arguably the way we think and behave. His former boss's initial description of his idea as vague but exciting might seem modest now, but that's an indication of the unforeseeable change it created. Tim Berners-Lee has devoted his time to advocating web freedom and access through his World Wide Web Foundation. Now he wants to challenge the power of big organizations online and reassert the web's original principles. But is it too late? Here's a taste of what's coming up. How happy are you with the digital world?
Recent events, including the pandemic, have heightened people's understanding out there that this is not just, the internet is a right, but it's not something you can take for granted. You have to fight for it.
When I've seen you, when I've been actually, face to face with you, with your creation, and there's only one that really comes to mind, which was your cameo in the London 2012 Olympic Games opening ceremony. You were on stage in an amazing looking sort of lit up house, and you looked like you're typing, and then a message appeared across the audience, beamed across the audience, which said, "This is for everyone." How did that feel, doing that, and being on that showcase?
It was being amazing.
So Tim, welcome to the programme. It's lovely to have you here, and we're going to come to your latest project very soon. But I wanted to ask, first of all, is it a burden being Tim Berners-Lee, the man who invented the World Wide Web?
I wouldn't say it's a burden. It doesn't seem, from my point of view, to be a burden, in that I'm not that famous for people recognizing me in the supermarket. On the other hand, inventing the World Wide Web means you do get invited to all kinds of great dinners and meet all kinds of people. So my life gets more interesting just for that. So I'm not a burden.
And I wonder for you, is there a pressure with it sometimes? Because when, I don't know, if I was sat next to you at a dinner and I asked you what you do and you say, of course, what you're working on now, but, I happen to invent this thing called the World Wide Web. Do you feel a pressure then to talk about things you've done since or how that compares?
I've learned from bitter experience that it's a good idea to say early on, by the way, I invented the web 30 years ago.
Just like that small
get
thing.
It on the table rather than spring it after 5 hours of conversation. But I think there's certainly, when we started the Web Foundation, there was a feeling that you can't just invent something when it gets to the point that 20% of the world is using it. Then there is a responsibility. And so it wasn't just me, but all the people involved in making the web more powerful realized that every step they made the web more powerful, the gap in power between those who had it and those who hadn't was increased, so the digital divide was increased every time we made the web better. And so that meant we had the Web Foundation was founded basically partly on simply, if 80% of the web at the time of the world wasn't on the web, then we should, the other 20% had a duty to get them on work, to get them on, and now it's more than half the world is on the web. So to some extent, we've got lots of momentum in that direction. But yes, I think there's a responsibility both for getting the other people on, but also, particularly in more recent years, realizing that it's not obvious that the web will actually be 100% a good thing. And actually, you also have to constantly be looking for what could go wrong and what has gone wrong and what could be fixed.
How happy are you with the digital world?
Stepping back very much, in general, I think you can't complain and I think the pandemic, I think, has showed a lot of people who didn't really think about it beforehand that actually, if they have the internet, they can work from home. If they don't have the internet, then they can't work from home. And then maybe people also think a little bit more about the fact that there hasn't been very much censorship in the country where they live, but they look and they see that people in other countries have the internet blocked completely during elections, for example, and so on. So I think that recent events, including the pandemic, have heightened people's understanding out there that this is not just, the internet is a right, but it's not something you can take for granted. We have to fight for it.
Yes, and the fight for the right to information, but also the correct information, free information, not fake news, and not have that layer on it. How do you think we're doing with that? Because some would say the internet has made things better in many ways, but worse on some of those fronts.
I think it really depends on which system you're talking about. So different social media systems are designed to work in different ways. You can like things and the like buttons and sort of the workflow you go through to encourage each other and give feedback to each other is different. And it turns out they have very different effects. So it turns out that early on, feminist bloggers found being on Twitter was just horrible, for example. And there are questions about being on Instagram. If you're a teenage girl, it can have psychological issues just with the things that the platform seems to do, suggest that you should do, that you have to be infinitely beautiful and things like that. So these are all different platforms. So it's not the web as a whole. It's a question of the design
what's been
of the
built
platforms.
on top of it.
Yeah. So what I tell people is, look, to start with, if you're a coder, whether or not you're not a coder, if you can imagine a social network that works differently and you think it would work, and you can imagine it would work, it would be a better place to be. Or maybe you could imagine a social network where people would tend to be more constructive, where you tend to get more truth out of it than untruth, because people will be more collaborative and more have a better culture. Then design that social network, or go to the people.
But that sounds like you believe design could be the answer, and that it can be a better world can be baked into the design, rather than what some people say, which is these platforms reflect back at us the societal ills. So it's not the platform's fault, it's who we are. And therefore they don't think the technology companies should do more, for instance, to get rid of the toxicity that many women find online.
I think it's naive to imagine, in a way, it's simplistic to imagine that things like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and so on and Reddit, that they are simple mirrors. Initially, I think when the early, maybe sort of in the pre-web days, when people were using the internet to exchange files, the meme was that the internet is neutral. That humanity out there is good and bad.
Yes.
When you connect to people, you could join them in an IRC chat room back there before the web, and you would find good and bad people. But actually, now, because we have these different platforms, and because they're different, actually, no. The Web Foundation, in fact, did some studies and looked at, when they were looking at misogyny online, they were looking at gender rights and online gender violence. And they found, for example, 3 things where a social media company could actually change the way the system worked, and it would make it better for women. And they went to those different companies and they suggested it, and the changes were made and the web got better. So there is a huge responsibility.
I'd like to feel some of those changes that you're talking about.
Maybe it did, yes, maybe they didn't fall as huge apples right next to you, but the message is really that, no, the way you design is important.
Yeah.
Humanity is important too. So when we do, everybody needs to help. So governments need to help by getting the laws in place, so things that are really, really nasty and illegal are illegal.
Yeah.
People need to, before they retweet something, before they like something, they need to also learn to actually do a double take.
But would you agree that it's going the other way? Because I always envisioned, and I used to work as a technology correspondent, that our offline selves and our online selves would come closer. As we got more used to using these platforms, we would try and not do something online that we wouldn't do in real life. And yet we seem to have done this. We project an image of who we want to be, and because of people being able to be anonymous, they are doing different things than they would do if they saw you in the street.
So, well, you're talking about, when you talk about people being anonymous, then maybe you're talking about Twitter. Maybe you're not talking about...
Or in the comments below articles or on videos. On this video, people can say whatever they want, but they wouldn't say it to your face.
I think, basically, stepping back, each of these the things which go wrong with each of these spaces depends on the way they're designed. And in each case the issues are different. In each case, you need to do lots of research to understand exactly how the badness and the goodness propagate, so that you can maybe amplify the goodness a bit. So, I still believe that being responsible online is part of it, and also the Weibo apps is part of it.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
When you think of cutting-edge technology at sea, you might be thinking of stuff like this. But there's an incoming revolution on the high seas that isn't quite as sexy, but could be significantly more impactful.
Container shipping is the key component of global trade. About 80 or 90% of all the world's goods are transported at sea at some point.
But there's a significant unseen cost to the modern era of global commerce.
About 3% of all the world's CO2 emissions come from shipping.
3% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly comparable to the entire CO2 output of Germany. Since reducing trade isn't a likely option, what about a technological improvement to help reduce the emissions from these well-stocked maritime behemoths?
You mentioned the World Wide Web Consortium, of which you're a director. The plan and the goal is obviously to hold big tech companies to account. But there has been concern because of how it's funded, with big tech helping to fund it, that there is a conflict of interest. And I suppose taking a step back, there is a concern about who marks these few tech giants' homeworks, who does hold them to account when we have so many governments who aren't tech savvy at all.
It's true that we need to get many more coders into positions into Parliament and into the judiciary, and so we do need. But if you asked particularly about WWC, WWC is a consortium of different companies where there are huge companies, there are the big companies, and there are lots of startups, and there are big companies. There's everything in between. There are academics and academic institutions and non-profits, and they all meet. And at the end of the day, every organization, no matter what its size, gets one vote. So you can't say, so no matter how much money people pour into it, that they might, for example, the mobile web initiative, everybody wanted to get the web onto mobile. So some companies said, yes, we're going to put my money into this for the accessibility, web accessibility initiative. Some companies specifically fund that. But there's a very, very strong culture that once the consortium has been funded by its members, then it operates as an independent body, which is independent,
And I think that's a very valid point to know about how it works. But I suppose I'm also asking a slightly bigger question, which is, do you have faith in those big technology companies, the Apples, the Googles, the Facebooks? I mean, they've got different parent names now, but, because they own several brands. but just use their household names. Do you have faith that they can be brought to task, that they can be policed and change their behaviour?
I know that, so I'm not going to talk about the individual companies in general. And so if you talk about big companies, then I know one thing I have said consistently is that there's always a problem when something becomes a monopoly. Whether it was Netscape was the only browser that you could buy, and then it was Microsoft was the only browser you could buy, and so on. So so Alta Vista was the only search engine, and so now it's so whenever you do get a problem that one company is dominating the space, that tends to be, the monopoly tends to mean it's not good for innovation, because that if you're just starting as another company, it's hard to imagine how your ideas can have impact. So yes, I think that you have so in a way there are always problems with monopolies, but although the market system tends to take us always naturally towards that situation. Then, but the state of whether individual, I'm not going to go into individual companies, to what extent I expect them to behave better or worse in the future, but everybody's asking that question. You're not the only one.
You're the Chief Technology Officer of a company called Inrupt, which has this new platform for the web called Solid. What is it, and what are you hoping to do? Because part of that is about changing people's behaviour.
So Solid is, if you like, from the point of view of inventing the web 30 years ago, the web, it's a midpoint correction to the web. The web was looked to be, people were very hopeful about the web. Then as it's continued for the second decade, then in the last decade, it seems to potentially be heading in place towards all kinds of potential things that could go wrong with humanity using technology connected. And so this is the idea about, wait a minute, what if we do some bit of a rethink? For example, when you work with one social network on one website, everything you've done there gets stored there. All the photos, all the likes get stored there. Or on Flickr, and if you're on Flickr, I've got these photos, and I can't share it. The system doesn't let me share my Flickr photographs with my LinkedIn colleagues and my Facebook friends, because we haven't exported, we don't have interoperability between the groups. We don't have the ability of a Google group to work in Facebook. And Solid is about saying, okay, let's fix that. So if you log in with Solid, then you have a Solid ID, which works all across the web. I can take photographs, I put them into my Solid storage, into my Solid pod, we call it, a personal online data. And when
so that's what you're calling them, pods, these digital pods, not, just want to try and imagine it. And so when you imagine
it, it's like a USB drive in the sky.
Yes.
It's just a place you can put stuff.
And can you actually do that? These walled gardens are set up because they're making money. That's how the brands want them to be. And a lot of people, conversely, are happy to use them because they're used to it now. And they think, well, this is how you use these platforms. How are you going to change behaviour and get people to think like this?
We're not going to wait for everybody to change over immediately at one point. We're just going to start people using, as people use the Solid platform, enabling of people. When people realise that they spend a lot of time working between different communities, for example, then all we need is enough people bit by bit to start using it and to realise it's better.
Are you doing this because you're frustrated with how the digital world has become? These separate...
I created the web because I was frustrated with how the digital world was, because then it was you had documents sitting on disks. The disks were on computers, the computers were connected to the internet, but you couldn't just click between them.
It's a pretty great invention. If I was frustrated with something, I just came up with the World Wide Web because I was annoyed about floppy disks.
So, well, I can imagine that actually, no, it could be much more powerful. I should be able to click between these documents instead of having to download them all separately. So you.
But I love that it was born from that.
I'm glad you like it. Go ahead. Anytime, be my guest.
No, but regardless of the platform, you're actually just saying to people, think about this differently. Think about your data. Think about how you are being used.
Yes. It is difficult. With the web, it's difficult. With the Solid, it's difficult. It turns the whole world of apps on sort of upside down, or the right way up, frankly. So the right way up is, yeah, of course, every time you do something. So when you go to have a vaccination, or you go for a run, or you go to a gym, and when you go to the gym and you log on to the gadget, And so that it will be natural that you log on with Solid, you give it your QR code, and you authenticate, and you say, yes, these devices in this gym can write all my stuff into my pod. Then bit by bit,
how are you going to cope if it doesn't work? Are you good with failure?
The developers around me are really excited about it, because for different reasons. It's really exciting as you're a developer as well. And so, so I think that, I would have been, except that, so one way of it going, for example, would be just to start a little group of people who just continue to battle on to build a better world, and bit by bit it grows. But when we started the company, in fact, yes, of course, we got interest from developers.
Well, I'm sure if your name's on something,
we got 100,000 people created it, sort of pods very quickly, but justified to try and understand what it was, and we got a company got interest from some big from big companies that realized that they could, if they used solid pod technology, they would be treating their users better, and they'd have a better relationship with their users, and they'd be empowering their users. But mainly, we got it coming from governments.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
But ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
I wanted to ask you, coming away from your company, you say this is a mid-course correction. I also like the fact you describe yourself as a geek. I always like that, people owning that word, as a very positive thing. But are you thinking about also, how do you think the future of the digital world we live in is going to change? What do you think that looks like?
People talk, is virtual reality, is the metaverse going to be, the future? And the answer is, well, it's going to be part of the future. It's going to be another piece. There was a time when the internet wasn't really fast enough to send movies, and so movies weren't really a thing. And then bit by bit, the computers got faster, and the networks got faster, and the discs got bigger, and now movies are a big thing. And if you have so we're getting, with VR, we're getting a new media. It'll be interesting how, I think you'll be able to sit between a movie and a VR world of that movie, for example.
Really?
That's what I hope, yeah. I hope that we'll be able to, for example, maybe we should have a future version of this conversation in the VR world, where we can see each other really well, just like we can, where we're not actually physically face-to-face, but then...
Although I've missed this. The pandemic meant that I have done so many of my interviews not face-to-face that I don't want to do what you've just described, although it sounds amazing.
But a lot of the core of whether we meet in VR, or whether we meet through video or face-to-face, the things we decide on, if we're at our meeting, the events that we agree on in the future, those will all be stored as data, which is data which we will be able to use much more effectively. I think also we'll be able to, hopefully, as this sort of revolution of personal empowerment flips the world back right upside down, when you have control of your data, one of the interesting things that comes out of this is an AI that works for you. Talk to your current AIs. Siri, who do you work for? Alexa, who do you work for? If they're honest, actually, it's not you. But imagine Charlie.
I never asked Siri that question. What would it say?
I think it was, it would have said, I worked for Steve Jobs, but now it'll say, I guess we work for Apple.
Have you ever asked it that question? It's a good one.
I think I have, but imagine you have a Charlie where Charlie says, actually, I work for you. Charlie says, you paid for me. You trust me with all your information.
Just a final thought, if I can. I was thinking, when I've seen you, when I've been actually, face to face with you, with your creation, and there's only one that really comes to mind, which was your cameo in the London 2012 Olympic Games opening ceremony. And for those who haven't seen it, obviously millions did. You were on stage in an amazing looking sort of lit up house, and you look like you're typing, and then a message appeared across the audience, beamed across the audience, which said, "This is for everyone." How did that feel, doing that, and being on that showcase?
It was being amazing. It was absolutely incredible. Such a privilege to be. I mean, to be asked to sit in that stadium with, to be part of the crew for the opening ceremony of the Olympics was all volunteers, a few total stars that I'd really respected, and you can meet backstage. And then when I was in that before
there's a house around you.
The house was around me,
didn't it?
And before it lifted up, I was sitting there, and I had to front myself against the back wall of the house because all thousands of dancers that had been dancing, all wearing different costumes. They'd all been dancing different dances, and they all left the entire stadium, came flocking in, and they all went in through the door of the house. And some of them, they all knew where to go. And I was standing against the floor, and they could go left or right and up and down. And they all had to disappear. And they came running, incredibly excited. They just had the dance of their lives.
Yes.
And they'd expressed their individuality, but also their the commonality of working together on the Olympic ceremony, and the commonality of working together for the Olympic Games. So that was just
amazing,
incredible.
Well, and such a powerful message. This is for everyone. What you created, that must have given you an amazing feeling. Sir Tim Berners-Lee, thank you so much for talking to me.
The pleasure's mine.
And thank you so much for being with us. Until we meet again, stay safe. Goodbye.
Whether you get your news on TV, on the radio,
on Bloomberg Radio,
on the web, on the Bloomberg Terminal, or the Bloomberg apps, the news that affects your business.
To recap the headlines.
You do not want to miss this story.
How are you thinking about those dynamics?
Is our business. Bloomberg TV and radio. The world is listening. Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon, Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
Everyone you meet in Port Harcourt has stories about what they call black soot, caused by the manufacturing and consumption of these fuel products in the illegal refineries.
Oil theft, known as bunkering, and the refining of its spoils is worsening the damage from decades of fossil fuel exploitation, creating one of the world's most severe ecological disasters.
Our sacred forests, our homes have to give way to oil wells, and no one gets much benefit.
Imagine a resident of Port Harcourt who inhales this soot every second in 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30 days in the month, and for years now, we are dying slowly but surely, and our lifespan is reducing every day.
So who's my guest this week? It's Niall DeMarco. From America's top model to Oscar-nominated film producer, he's become an ambassador for deaf pride, taking on the hearing world on his own terms. He's fourth-generation deaf, choosing not to communicate vocally, and has long challenged the notion that learning to sign can hinder the ability to speak English. His memoir, Deaf Utopia, is a love letter to American Sign Language, explaining why he doesn't think deafness needs fixing. You're going to hear why competing in America's Next Top Model was hell, and why he's pretty annoyed with Will Smith. Did you see the slap? We're talking about Will Smith, of course, here.
Oh, I did, in fact, see it all. I mean, I think everyone in the audience was quite confused initially. It seemed like a joke, or like a scripted bit, but no. Soon as Will Smith started screaming, my interpreter let me know, and everybody went quiet. And I thought, what are you doing stealing our spotlight? Come on, Will.
Yeah, I was going to say, that must have been, I mean, were you actually annoyed about that? Was anyone frustrated in the deaf community? Because it really was the thing.
Yeah, certainly. It was my first thought. I felt like, this is such a historic moment, and it really felt like a moment for us. And I thought, at least let us have this one night. But, it's very typical for hearing people to want to center themselves and ask us to just orbit them.
Niall DeMarco, welcome to the programme. It's really good to have you on the show. And I should say, we'll be speaking to each other through an interpreter today. But what I wanted to start by asking you, right at the heart of your book, the title no less, is what would a deaf utopia look like to you?
Good morning. A deaf utopia, I think, for me, would certainly look like a place where we all have complete access, which means a world inclusive of sign language, but also with accessible features that make deaf people feel like we can really connect and belong on this planet.
What does that mean? I suppose what I'm asking is, what don't we have at the moment?
Well, I'd say some of the things that we don't have, just in general, is a lack of deaf culture awareness. So many people that I meet who are hearing and conversation often remind me that they don't know that deaf culture exists. They don't really realize that we have a community. And from their perspective, deafness is a disability and couldn't possibly be inclusive of a culture, which, in fact, is not true. We have a language which gives rise to culture. I think essentially that really starts with their lack of awareness.
You also mentioned there the need for sign to be better understood or better recognized. Are you talking about in a deaf utopia, everyone would be able to have some kind of literacy?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I would love that. I think that's probably one of the biggest goals that we really have as a community. Sign language has incredible benefits for hearing people and for deaf people alike, right? In sign language, we can speak and communicate faster than in English. We can also talk through windows and underwater. How cool is that?
Yes, it really is. I hadn't thought about that at all. But yeah, there are other things I'll come to from some of your stories about some of the benefits people may not have realized, not least having a party at home without your mum knowing because you could just shut the door and go for it. And I think some of those examples are amazing.
Yeah, honestly, we call that hashtag deaf games. Being from a deaf family is incredible, but it's also incredibly rare. And I think kids like me tend to abuse it. My mom, being such a good sleeper, was really helpful for us when we wanted to rage at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning.
I mean, you mentioned your family, you're 4th generation deaf. What did that mean growing up in your family with how you learned to communicate and the culture around you?
Definitely. Being born to an entirely deaf family and having deaf parents meant that I had access to language day one. To be honest, I don't really remember first learning to sign. Like many other people don't really remember their first words either.
It's something that I wanted to hear your view on because we've just been through a pandemic. I mean, we're still in it in lots of ways. And people were having to homeschool. And then I imagine for those children, didn't have access to the deaf schools and to their peers, to the people that they were used to being with.
Absolutely. And it's a great point. It was a very large problem in the community. Deaf schools all over were faced with an entirely new issue of how they bring the exposure to the parents and how do they bring them in home? How do they provide access to language and continue exposing them to our culture and continue to give them not only exposure to their role models, but also the ability to socialize. Having to send those children home to a place where they couldn't practice sign was in many ways traumatic for so many kids out there. And an entirely new issue that we faced with the pandemic. You're absolutely right.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
I suppose the other thing as well, and I wonder if you had an experience of this, is everyone was wearing masks, and a lot of people still are. Was that difficult for you during the pandemic?
Definitely. You know, for me, in everyday life, I depend on lip reading often. You know, and honestly, lip reading is certainly not the best way to communicate. If you look at any of the statistics, you see that even the best of lip readers can only catch about 30%. But suddenly with a mask, I was at 0. So all of the guesswork was gone. Of course, it was frustrating, but I think all of us really were in this together.
Yes, well, it's lovely to be able to see your face.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Likewise. Happy to take those off, for sure. And it's nice to be able to see people's faces now.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the real expressions. I'm obviously minded of the fact that a lot of people really liked your face because you won America's Next Top Model. That's something that we should bring up. But I wonder when when going onto that program, were you thinking about how it was going to work that you don't talk, in the sense of how some people were going to then find it to communicate with you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was honestly one of the first things that I considered. I remember when America's Next Top Model first reached out to me for the audition, I ignored it. You know, of course, any type of reality TV show, and certainly a competition, I felt like wasn't going to be ready for a deaf person. I certainly had never seen one on TV before. But, you know, they reached out multiple times, and finally I responded and said, "Are you really ready for a deaf contestant in the first place?" They said yes. So I started the journey. But of course, it was tough. I did have an interpreter on set, but only 10% of the time, meaning 90% of the time, I was lacking the ability to really communicate fully. I don't think they really understood the accessibility needs that really came along with the deaf contestant, but also how to accommodate. And so much of it just comes with, you know, reality TV shows, the, you know, psychological warfare, the mind games, you know, the causing drama to make better TV. And I certainly get that perspective. But I survived through 4 months of it. And would I do it again? No, I'd rather not walk through hell.
Not walk through hell? Why hell?
Well, I'll tell you, 4 months, I mean, imagine for 4 months, you could only use, say, spoken English for 10% of the time. I was texting back and forth with everybody else, which is incredibly limited. I mean, think about how fast we can text, right? It doesn't really carry like a conversation. So to only be able to use your language about 10% of the time, you know, your language that gives you not only dignity, but who you are. It's, you know, your self-confidence, your pride, and your ability to express.
I think that the minute you start to think about that, you would feel incredibly isolated if that had been your experience. And yet, you could also could also be forgiven to think being a model is perhaps a good profession in the sense of at least you don't have to talk when you're doing the modeling part.
Right, exactly. And to be honest with you, it was an incredibly isolating experience, but I think in the end, I really was planning for a result. I was looking forward to the end, and not only to win for myself, but also to win for the community, and to be able to elevate the amount of awareness of our culture and our community, which I think really was more important. You know, honestly, modeling as a deaf person, there's a lot of benefits, right? I come from a very visual culture where we study body language. So it's definitely a different level being able to study a photographer and what they're looking for, and also to be able to emulate the poses. I mean, body language is really what we're experts in.
Yeah, I'm now just thinking about how I'm sitting, what I'm giving off to you here. I'm going to think this through a bit more, but it's one of those things that must be a bit of a superpower.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And if you take a look at any of the articles out there about deaf people's peripheral vision, you'll actually see that studies have been done to show that it's enhanced, it's widened. We actually see more and we take more of the world in than hearing people. So, yeah, we're superheroes.
You'll take that, I'm sure. And it's something, you know, again, to think about, a different way of seeing the world and actually reading the world while you're in it. You also, of course, are known for Dancing with the Stars and music. It seems, again, if you haven't thought about the deaf world, the deaf culture is an incredibly important part of being in the world. And it's that experience, I understand, of feeling the beat.
Well, I mean, personally, do I feel that if you're asking if I could feel the beat on set, I'll be honest, I couldn't hear or feel anything. So our rehearsals were pretty interesting in that we had to practice using other systems. We would often use larger studios that were quite wide open. And the system that PETA and I developed was counting. It was just simple math. But we also shared a cue system that we developed. For example, if PETA tapped me, that was, say, to begin the routine. A hand squeeze would mean that we were going to switch specific formation or footwork. Scratch on my back might have meant that I was late. So to the audience at home, of course, nobody noticed. But if you go back and watch some of the reruns, you'll be able to catch some of those cues.
But for some people, they do talk about being able to feel some of the beat, but you couldn't feel anything.
Right. It really just depends on where you are. So my twin brother, actually, who is also deaf, is a DJ, if you can believe, has an amazing, brilliant professional setup that's like something like 2,000 watts. It's absolutely insane. But on Dancing with the Stars, I couldn't feel anything like what he can in the DJ booth. But, you know, there was a moment, certainly, where we had a couple of NFL dancers who came on, which was really great. And the funny thing was, they couldn't catch their footwork, right? They just couldn't get the timing right. And at the end, I couldn't hear any of it. I couldn't feel any of it. And I was still able to keep the math perfectly on time, which is kind of ironic, right? I'm the only one in the room who can't hear, and yet I'm matching up.
Yeah, well, congratulations belatedly for that, because it was obviously a huge success as well. But I suppose what's been driving your work as well to this point, because you've been working now as a producer as well, Oscar nominated. Congratulations for Audible on Netflix.
Thank you very much.
I mean, that must have been quite the night, especially because of Coda as well, winning.
Oh, it was incredible. It was incredible. And truly a watershed moment for our community. If you consider that it's been 35 years since we've had another member of the deaf community take to the Oscar stage, it's really incredible. Marley Matlin's work in this industry, I mean, really, truly speaks for itself. But that night we had over 10 deaf people on the red carpet. It was incredible to see that amount of representation. And the wins that night, I mean, if you consider 3 wins alone from Coda, was really groundbreaking. And I think it shows that the time is now. It really feels like people at home are really hungry for our stories. And we're really looking to make this a movement rather than a moment. I think right now, we have to start bringing deaf people in behind the camera, right? Which is so key to authenticity, because that truly is where it begins.
Yes, although the Oscars this year also bring to mind something else. I was wondering, did you see the slap? We're talking about Will Smith, of course, here.
Oh, I did, in fact, see it all. I mean, I think everyone in the audience was quite confused initially. It seemed like a joke or like a scripted bit, but no. Soon as Will Smith started screaming, "My interpreter let me know," and everybody went quiet. And I thought, what are you doing stealing our spotlight? Come on, Will.
Yeah, I was going to say, that must have been, I mean, were you actually annoyed about that? Was anyone frustrated in the deaf community? Because it really was the thing.
Yeah, certainly. It was my first thought. I felt like, you know, this is such a historic moment, and it really felt like a moment for us. And I thought, at least let us have this one night. But, you know, it's very typical for hearing people to want to center themselves and ask us to just orbit them.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
The Indian city of Jamnagar is a money-making machine for Asia's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. His company Reliance has the world's biggest oil refinery complex here in the city. Jamnagar is also where Ambani is making his newest bet, a $10 billion investment in green energy. His ambition is closely aligned with the Indian government's plan to reach net zero emissions by 2070. But Ambani is not alone. India's second richest man, Gautam Adani, has committed $20 billion of investment over the next decade. But India's massive dependencies on fossil fuels have some environmental advocates questioning the realism and sincerity of those green ambitions and those of its 2 biggest billionaires.
Yeah, although I'm also now trying to imagine your interpreter telling you what Will Smith was saying and you getting that as well, because if you could hear it and see it, it was, as you said, you didn't believe it.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So during the Oscars, they had 2 large TV screens on both sides. And so I was able to see Will because they had panned over to him. And I could clearly see a reaction of what was going on. But when I asked my interpreter what he was saying, it became very evident that it was not a scripted bit at all.
Yeah, and you definitely didn't need to be able to hear to understand the last bit, right? Talking about body language.
Right, definitely. Immediately, and I could lip read them on the cameras as well. It was loud, clear as that.
It was, yeah, well, quite the moment. But as you say, quite the moment for the deaf community as well that night. And I know that you also feel very passionately, you say about people behind the camera, but also on the camera. You are of the view that deaf actors should be playing the deaf roles?
Absolutely. Definitely. I mean, I don't think that deaf people only ever have to play deaf roles, certainly, but I think that auditions should be open to everyone, including members of our community. And I think we're at a point where we shouldn't be hiring hearing people to play a deaf role, certainly. So many people, I think, assume that it's easy to take on the role of a deaf person, but can they actually really go in there and kill the audition? I don't think so, right? Oftentimes people are learning sign language a few minutes ahead of time, and, sign language takes years and years and years to be able to really become fluent in, but also there's a cultural nuance that's really ingrained in us that I think really shows on screen.
I had a son a few years ago, and we went to a baby sign class, and the reason the woman had started the class was because her sister was deaf. So she had signed her whole life, and it was an amazing way to communicate with your child. And we are not deaf, but I greatly enjoyed the class.
It's fantastic. A lot of people, I don't think, really realize that we have a lot of apps available, right? We have the ASL app, which I was thrilled to work on, that provides sign language, right? That can teach you a little bit, not only about our language, but also culture. Technology really is amazing.
It really is. Just talking about children, there is someone you quote in the book about this whole area around generations and the way that this is or shouldn't be talked about and has been in the past. You quote the view of the man who patented the first telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, who, despite marrying a deaf woman, didn't believe deaf people should marry each other because of the risk of deaf children. Why did you include that in the book?
I included it, I think, because it's important for hearing people to read and really understand that deaf issues are not new, right? That language deprivation did not arrive recently. But this has been centuries and centuries of oppression and deprivation. In my book, I really work to outline the events, sort of our history and bring those to modern day, which I think a lot of people don't realize.
But of course, what he was saying, as horrible and unpalatable as it is to hear, or to say, I should say, certainly in this, was a lot of the people's view at the time and may continue to be. And I just wondered, as your fourth generation within a family like that, what is your message on that point? And also, how has it made you think about your future?
I would say, to be honest with you, I would be open to marrying a deaf or a hearing person, right? I think what's really important is sort of that connection. But, I think we should all trust our kids and certainly ourselves to know that when we fall in love, it's right. I don't think that we should certainly, love is not expensive, right? But it's, available to all of us, I think.
I suppose that the other question there is around children. You may not have got that far, and I'm not meaning to pry, but when you think about, if you think about such things, do you ever think about their lives and how you would want their lives to be with your own experiences and with your siblings?
So I'll tell you, a big part of deaf culture is that we want to be able to pass it on like any of our cultures, right? We want to be able to give our children that sense of community. I would love to have a deaf child, but, I think I would